My name is Wendell Kirkland, and I've been hauling freight across state lines for the better part of 11 years now. I've seen my share of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that run from Tucson to Phoenix back in the spring of 2019. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking about the weight of that cargo and the look in that border agent's eyes when he told me to keep my mouth shut and drive. I was working for a mid-sized logistics company out of Albuquerque at the time. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and they didn't ask too many questions about your background, which suited me just fine. I'd had some trouble with the law in my younger days, nothing violent. Just some DUIs and a possession charge that made finding decent work a real pain in the ass. The company knew about my record, and they hired me anyway, which meant I owed them a certain degree of loyalty, or at least that's what I told myself when things started going sideways. The job came through on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in a truck stop outside of Tucson drinking burnt coffee and trying to decide if I wanted to spring for the meatloaf special when my dispatcher called. Her name was Rita, and she had this raspy smoker's voice that always made her sound annoyed, even when she wasn't. She told me there was a priority load that needed to go out that night headed for a warehouse in Phoenix. The pay was double my usual rate, which immediately struck me as odd, but Rita explained it away by saying the client needed it there by dawn and was willing to pay premium for the overnight haul. I asked her what the cargo was, and she paused for just a second too long before telling me it was restaurant equipment. Industrial freezers and refrigeration units destined for some new resort that was opening up in Scottsdale. It sounded plausible enough, and the money was too good to pass up, so I told her I'd take it. She gave me the address of the pickup location, which was at a warehouse on the outskirts of Tucson near the airport. She said the load would be ready by 8 that evening, and that I should plan on hitting the road by 9 at the latest. I killed a few hours at the truck stop trying to rest up for the overnight drive. I've never been great at sleeping during the day, though, and I ended up just lying in the sleeper cab staring at the ceiling and listening to the highway traffic rumble past. Around 7, I fired up the engine and made my way over to the pickup location. The address took me to an industrial area that I wasn't familiar with, all corrugated metal buildings and chain-link fences with hardly any streetlights to speak of. The whole area had this abandoned feeling to it, like most of the businesses had packed up and left years ago. I found the warehouse easily enough. It was a massive steel structure with a loading dock and a small office attached to the side. There were a couple of other semis parked in the lot, but no signs of life otherwise. I backed my truck up to the loading dock and killed the engine. The sun was just starting to set, and the sky had turned this deep orange color that made everything look like it was on fire. I sat there for a minute, taking in the silence. There was something off about the whole setup, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe it was just the isolation of the location, or the fact that there didn't seem to be anyone around despite the fact that I was supposedly picking up a priority load. I climbed out of the cab and walked over to the office door. It was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The office was small and cramped with a metal desk and a couple of filing cabinets shoved against the walls. There was a man sitting behind the desk, and he looked up when I came in. He was maybe in his mid-40s with thinning hair and a thick mustache that drooped down past the corners of his mouth. He was wearing a Border Patrol uniform, which caught me off guard. I'd picked up loads all over the Southwest, and I'd never once had a border agent involved in the process. He stood up and extended his hand. He introduced himself as Saul Everman and said he was there to oversee the loading process. I shook his hand and told him my name. His grip was firm and his palm was rough, like he'd spent a lot of time doing manual labor. He had this intense way of looking at you like he was trying to read your thoughts, and it made me uncomfortable. I asked him why Border Patrol was involved in loading restaurant equipment, and he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He told me it was just routine that any cargo moving through this part of Arizona close to the border had to be inspected and cleared before it could be transported north. That explanation didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't in a position to argue. I needed the money, and I'd already committed to the job. Saul Everman told me to follow him out to the loading dock. We walked through a side door and into the warehouse proper. The space was huge and mostly empty except for a few pallets stacked near the loading dock. There were 2 other men waiting there, both of them wearing jeans and work boots, and neither of them said a word when we approached. They had this hard look about them, like they'd spent time in prison or worse. The pallets were wrapped in thick plastic sheeting and strapped down with the industrial-grade tie-downs. Saul Everman gestured toward them and told me that was my cargo. I walked over and tried to peer through the plastic, but I couldn't make out what was inside. I asked him if I could inspect the load before we got it on the truck, and his expression darkened. He told me that wouldn't be necessary, that everything had already been cleared and documented. He said my job was to drive, not to ask questions. I should have walked away right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was wrong, but I thought about the money and the bills piling up back home, and I kept my mouth shut. The 2 silent men used a forklift to load the pallets onto my trailer. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes, and nobody said a word the entire time. When they were finished, Saul Everman handed me a clipboard with some paperwork. He told me to sign at the bottom and not to worry about reading through it. I signed my name and handed the clipboard back to him. He walked me back to my truck and waited while I climbed into the cab. Before I could close the door, he leaned in and told me something that made my blood run cold. He said the load I was carrying was sensitive, and that there were people who would be very unhappy if it didn't reach its destination on time. He said I should drive straight through without stopping, and that if anyone asked me what I was hauling, I should tell them it was restaurant equipment and nothing more. Then he smiled again, that same cold smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told me to have a safe trip. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I'd just gotten myself into something bad, but I didn't know how bad yet. I merged onto the highway headed north toward Phoenix. The sun had set by then, and the desert stretched out on either side of me, dark and empty. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting, that it was probably just some under-the-table deal to avoid taxes or regulations. People bent the rules all the time in this business, and it didn't necessarily mean anything sinister was going on. But I couldn't shake the image of Saul Everman's face, or the way those 2 men had looked at me like I was already dead. I reached over and turned on the radio, hoping some music would calm my nerves. A country station crackled to life, and I let the sound fill the cab. I focused on the road ahead, trying not to think about what might be wrapped up in those pallets in my trailer. The highway was mostly empty at that hour, just a few cars passing by in the opposite direction. I kept my speed steady and tried to blend in with what little traffic there was. About 30 miles outside of Tucson, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. My stomach dropped and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. It was a state trooper, and he was closing in fast. I checked my speedometer to make sure I wasn't going over the limit. I wasn't. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least not that I was aware of. The trooper pulled up behind me and hit his siren. I slowed down and started looking for a place to pull over. There was a wide shoulder coming up, and I eased the truck onto it and came to a stop. I sat there with the engine idling, watching in the side mirror, as the trooper got out of his cruiser and walked toward my truck. He was a young guy, maybe late 20s, with a buzz cut and a stiff uniform that looked like it had just come out of the package. He approached my window and I rolled it down. He asked for my license and registration and I handed them over. My hands were trembling and I hoped he didn't notice. He looked at my license for a long moment and then asked me where I was headed. I told him Phoenix. He asked me what I was hauling and I remembered what Saul Everman had told me. I said, restaurant equipment. The trooper nodded slowly and then asked if he could take a look in the back. I felt my throat tighten. I told him sure and climbed out of the cab. We walked around to the rear of the trailer and I unlocked the doors and swung them open. The trooper pulled out a flashlight and shined it inside. The beam played across the wrapped pallets and he stepped closer to get a better look. I held my breath waiting for him to tell me to unwrap them so he could inspect the cargo. But he didn't. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then he clicked off his flashlight and stepped back. He told me everything looked fine, and handed my license and registration back to me. He said I had a taillight out, and that I should get it fixed as soon as possible. Then he walked back to his cruiser and drove off. I stood there in the dark, staring after him, trying to process what had just happened. There was no way he'd pulled me over for a taillight. He'd been looking for something specific, and for whatever reason he'd decided to let me go. I climbed back into the cab and sat there for a minute, trying to calm my racing heart. I pulled back onto the highway and kept driving. The encounter with the trooper had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see more flashing lights, but the road behind me stayed dark. I tried calling Rita to tell her what had happened, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking her to call me back, but I had a sinking feeling she wouldn't. The miles ticked by slowly, and the desert seemed to close in around me. I passed a few small towns, but I didn't stop. I thought about what Saul Everman had said about driving straight through, and I decided it was probably in my best interest to follow his instructions. Whatever was in my trailer, I didn't want to know. I just wanted to deliver it and get paid and forget this whole thing ever happened. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Around midnight, I started to get drowsy. I'd been driving for hours, and the adrenaline from the traffic stop had worn off, leaving me exhausted. I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd brought with me and took a long sip. It was cold and bitter, but it helped a little. I rolled down the window to let some fresh air in, and the cool desert breeze hit my face. I could smell creosote and dust, and something else underneath it, something faint and sour that I couldn't quite place. I was about an hour outside of Phoenix when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think anything of it, just another car on the highway, but then I noticed it was staying behind me, keeping pace no matter how fast or slow I went. I sped up a little and the car sped up too. I slowed down and it slowed down. My pulse quickened and I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping back in. The car stayed on my tail for miles, never getting closer but never falling back either. I couldn't make out the make or model, just two bright headlights burning through the darkness. I thought about pulling over to see what they wanted, but I remembered Saul Everman's warning about driving straight through. I kept going, hoping the car would eventually turn off or pass me. But it didn't. It just stayed there like a shadow, following me through the night. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. Maybe it was someone else headed to Phoenix who happened to be driving the same speed as me. But I didn't believe that. I knew I was being followed, and I knew it had something to do with the cargo in my trailer. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes on the road ahead. The lights of Phoenix were starting to appear on the horizon, and I prayed I could make it to the warehouse without anything going wrong. As I got closer to the city, the car behind me finally made its move. It sped up and pulled into the left lane, coming up alongside me. I glanced over and saw it was a black SUV with tinted windows. The passenger window rolled down, and I could see a figure inside, but I couldn't make out any details. The SUV paced me for a moment, and then it accelerated and cut in front of me, forcing me to hit my brakes. I cursed under my breath and tightened my grip on the wheel. The SUV slowed down, matching my speed again. It was toying with me. I thought about trying to pass it, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, and I wasn't about to find out the hard way. I kept my distance and followed the SUV as it led me off the highway and onto a side road. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. The side road took us into an industrial area not unlike the one where I'd picked up the load. The SUV pulled into a lot behind a rundown warehouse and I followed. The moment I stopped the truck, the SUV's doors opened, and 3 figures stepped out. They were all wearing dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. One of them was carrying something in his hand, and as he got closer, I realized it was a gun. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial 911, the man with the gun tapped on my window with the barrel. He motioned for me to roll it down, and I did. He leaned in close enough that I could smell cigarette smoke on his breath and told me to get out of the truck. I did what he said. I climbed down from the cab and stood there with my hands raised, trying to show I wasn't a threat. The man with the gun told me to open the trailer. I walked around to the back and unlocked the doors. The 3 men moved past me and climbed inside. I stood there listening to the sound of plastic being torn and pallets being shifted. After a few minutes, one of them jumped down and told the other something I couldn't hear. They spent another 10 minutes inside the trailer, and then they all climbed out. The man with the gun looked at me and told me I'd done a good job. He said I should get back in my truck and finish the delivery like nothing had happened. He said if I told anyone about this stop or about them, they'd know, and they'd come looking for me. Then he and the other 2 men got back in the SUV and drove off, leaving me standing there in the dark. I climbed back into the truck and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I should call the police, but I also knew that would only make things worse. Whoever these people were, they were connected, and they weren't afraid to use violence. I thought about Saul Everman and the way he'd looked at me back at the warehouse. I wondered if he was part of this or if he was just another cog in the machine. Eventually, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. I drove the rest of the way to the Phoenix warehouse in silence. When I got there, the loading dock was empty, and there was no one waiting for me. I backed the truck up to the dock and sat there for a while, trying to decide what to do. Finally, I got out and opened the trailer doors. The pallets were still there, but some of the plastic had been torn away, and I could see what was inside now. It wasn't restaurant equipment. The packages inside weren't freezers or refrigeration units. They were bundles wrapped in heavy plastic and duct tape, the kind of packaging you see in movies about drug smugglers or worse. I stood there, staring at them, feeling my stomach turn over. I'd suspected something was off from the beginning, but seeing it laid out in front of me like that made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I reached out and touched one of the bundles. It was solid and heavy, and I pulled my hand back like I'd been burned. I should have called the cops right then and there. That's what any reasonable person would have done. But I kept thinking about the man with the gun, and the way he'd looked at me when he said they'd come looking for me if I talked. I thought about Saul Everman and how he'd known exactly what was in these pallets when he loaded them onto my truck. I thought about Rita and how she'd gone silent after sending me on this job. The whole thing was a setup, and I was stuck right in the middle of it. I climbed back into the cab and sat there with the engine off, just listening to the sound of my own breathing. The warehouse district was quiet at that hour. Nothing but the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the darkness. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, trying to decide what to do. I could call the police and tell them everything, but that would mean admitting I'd knowingly transported illegal cargo across state lines. I could lose my license, my job, maybe even end up in prison. And that was assuming the people who'd stopped me on the side of the road didn't get to me first. I thought about just driving away, leaving the truck and the cargo and disappearing into the night. I had some money saved up, not much, but enough to get me out of Arizona and maybe start over somewhere else. But I knew that was a fantasy. These people, whoever they were, had my name, my phone number, probably my address. If I ran, they'd find me eventually. The only way out was through. I started the engine and pulled away from the loading dock. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to move to do something other than sit there paralyzed by fear and indecision. I drove through the empty streets of Phoenix, aimlessly turning down one road and then another. The city was still asleep, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. I felt like I was the only person left in the world. After about 20 minutes of driving, I found myself pulling into a 24-hour diner. I needed coffee, and I needed to think. I parked the truck in the lot and walked inside. The place was nearly empty, just a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and an old man sitting in a booth by the window nursing a cup of coffee. I slid into a booth near the back and ordered coffee and a plate of eggs I had no intention of eating. The waitress brought my order, and I sat there stirring sugar into my coffee and trying to figure out my next move. I kept replaying the events of the night in my head, looking for some detail I'd missed, some clue that might tell me who these people were or what they wanted. But I kept coming back to the same conclusion I was in over my head, and I didn't know how to get out. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the man slide into the booth across from me until he cleared his throat. I looked up and my blood went cold. It was Saul Everman. He was wearing civilian clothes now, jeans and a flannel shirt, but I recognized his face immediately. He smiled at me, that same cold smile from the warehouse, and gestured for me to stay seated. He told me he'd been following me since I left the pickup location. He said he wanted to make sure the delivery went smoothly and that there weren't any complications. I asked him what the hell I'd just hauled across the state, and he leaned back in the booth and crossed his arms. He said it didn't matter what it was, that my job had been to drive, and I'd done that. He said as long as I kept my mouth shut, everything would be fine. I told him I didn't want any part of this, that I was done. He laughed and shook his head. He said it was too late for that now that I was already involved, whether I liked it or not. He said the people he worked for had eyes everywhere, and that if I tried to go to the police or if I tried to run, they'd know. He said the best thing I could do was forget about tonight and move on with my life. I felt anger rising in my chest, replacing the fear that had been there a moment before. I asked him who the hell he thought he was threatening me like that. He didn't flinch. He leaned forward and told me in a low voice that he wasn't threatening me, he was giving me advice. He said he'd seen what happened to people who didn't take that advice, and it wasn't pretty. Then he stood up, dropped a $20 bill on the table, and walked out of the diner. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the $20 bill like it was a snake coiled up on the table. The waitress came by and asked if I wanted more coffee, but I shook my head and told her I was fine. I paid for my meal and walked back out to the truck. The sun was starting to rise and the sky was turning pink and orange. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was dread. I drove back to the warehouse and parked the truck in the lot. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave it there, and I couldn't take it back to the company yard without explaining what had happened. I sat in the cab watching the sun come up and trying to figure out what my next move was. That's when my phone rang. It was Rita. She sounded different on the phone, not as sharp or businesslike as usual. She asked me if the delivery had gone okay, and I told her it had. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me the client had called and said they were very happy with my work. She said there might be more jobs like this in the future if I was interested. I told her I'd think about it, and she hung up. I knew what that meant. This wasn't a one-time thing. They were testing me, seeing if I'd keep my mouth shut and do what I was told. And if I passed the test, there would be more loads, more deliveries, more nights like this one. I thought about refusing, about telling Rita I was done with the company and finding work somewhere else. But I also thought about Saul Everman and the man with the gun, and the way they'd both made it clear that walking away wasn't an option. I spent the rest of that day in a fog. I drove back to my apartment and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those bundles wrapped in plastic and duct tape. I saw Saul Everman's cold smile and the barrel of the gun tapping against my window. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in around me, and there was no way out. Over the next few days, I waited for something to happen. I kept expecting the police to show up at my door, or for the company to fire me, or for those men in the SUV to come back. But nothing happened. Life just went on like normal. Rita called with more jobs, regular, legitimate loads that took me up and down the interstate. I took them and tried to pretend that night in Tucson had never happened. But it had happened, and I couldn't forget it no matter how hard I tried. I started drinking more than I should, trying to dull the anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking up every few hours drenched in sweat from nightmares I couldn't remember. I knew I was falling apart, but I didn't know how to stop it. About 2 weeks after the Phoenix run, Rita called me with another priority load. She said it was the same client as before, and that they'd specifically requested me. My stomach dropped, and I felt that familiar wave of panic wash over me. I asked her if it was the same kind of cargo, and she didn't answer right away. Finally, she said yes, and that the pay would be the same as last time. She said I should think of it as easy money. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell her to find someone else, that I was done with this. But I also knew what would happen if I refused. Saul Everman had made that clear. So I said yes, and Rita gave me the details. The pickup was at the same warehouse outside Tucson, and the delivery was to a different location in Phoenix. She said the load needed to go out that night, and that I should be at the warehouse by 8. I spent the rest of the day trying to talk myself out of it. I thought about calling the police, about telling them everything and hoping they could protect me. But I also knew that was naive. These people had resources and connections that I couldn't even begin to understand. If I went to the cops, I'd be signing my own death warrant. That evening, I drove out to the warehouse. It was the same setup as before, the same deserted industrial area, the same loading dock. Saul Everman was there waiting for me. He greeted me like we were old friends, shaking my hand and asking how I'd been. I didn't answer. I just followed him into the warehouse and watched as the same 2 silent men loaded the pallets onto my trailer. This time, I didn't ask any questions. I signed the paperwork and climbed into my truck and pulled out of the lot. Saul Everman stood in the doorway watching me go, and I could feel his eyes on me even after I'd turned onto the highway. I drove north toward Phoenix, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The drive was uneventful this time. No state troopers, no black SUVs following me through the night. I made it to the delivery location without incident and backed the truck up to the loading dock. This time there were people waiting for me, 3 men I didn't recognize who unloaded the cargo quickly and efficiently. They didn't say a word to me, and I didn't say anything to them. When they were done, one of them handed me an envelope. I opened it and found a thick stack of cash inside. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the parking lot counting the money. It was more than I made in a month of regular hauling. I thought about what I could do with it, pay off some debt, maybe take a trip somewhere far away from Arizona and the people who dragged me into this mess. But I knew that was just another fantasy. The money came with strings attached, and those strings were wrapped around my neck, getting tighter with every job I took. Over the next few months, I made 4 more runs for the same client. Each time, it was the same routine, the same warehouse, the same silent men loading the cargo, the same envelope full of cash at the end. I stopped asking questions, and I stopped thinking about what I was doing. I just drove and collected my money and tried not to let it eat away at me, but it did eat away at me. I could feel it happening slowly, like rust spreading through metal. I stopped seeing my friends, stopped going to the places I used to go. I spent most of my time alone, either on the road or holed up in my apartment drinking and trying to forget. I knew I was losing myself, but I didn't know how to stop it. One night, after finishing another delivery, I was driving back through Phoenix when I saw police lights in my rearview mirror. My heart started racing and I felt that familiar panic set in. I pulled over and waited as a state trooper approached my window. It was the same young trooper who'd stopped me on my first run, the one with the buzz cut and the stiff uniform. He asked for my license and registration, and I handed them over. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he looked at me. He asked me if I remembered him, and I nodded. He asked me how many more runs I'd made since that night, and I didn't answer. He told me he knew what I was hauling, and that he knew who I was working for. He said I was in serious trouble, and that if I didn't cooperate with the law enforcement, things were going to get a lot worse for me. I sat there staring at him, trying to process what he was saying. He told me he was part of a task force investigating smuggling operations along the border, and that they'd been watching Saul Everman and his associates for months. He said they knew about the warehouse and the loads and the money. He said they had enough evidence to put me away for years, but that they were willing to cut me a deal if I agreed to testify. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him everything to unload the weight I'd been carrying around for months. But another part of me knew that cooperating with the police would be a death sentence. Saul Everman had made it clear what happened to people who talked, and I had no reason to doubt him. The trooper must have seen the fear in my eyes because he softened a little. He told me I didn't have to decide right then, that I should think about it and call him when I was ready. He handed me a business card with his number on it and told me to be careful. Then he got back in his cruiser and drove off. I sat there in the dark, holding the business card and trying to figure out what to do. I knew the walls were closing in and that eventually I'd have to make a choice. I could keep working for Saul Everman and his people and hope that I didn't get caught or killed. Or I could cooperate with the police and hope that they could protect me from the people I'd been working for. Neither option seemed good. Both of them felt like a trap. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. I drove for hours, just driving with no destination in mind. I thought about my life and how I'd ended up here. I thought about the choices I'd made and the roads I'd taken that had led me to this moment. By the time the sun came up, I still didn't have an answer. I was tired and scared, and I didn't know who to trust. All I knew was that I couldn't keep doing this, that eventually something was going to give. I just hoped that when it did, I'd still be alive to see it. I pulled into a rest stop and parked the truck. I sat there watching the morning traffic roll by and thinking about the business card in my pocket. The trooper had given me a way out, but taking it would mean putting my life in the hands of people I didn't know, and hoping they could keep me safe from people who'd already proven they could get to me anywhere. I thought about calling him right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I just sat there paralyzed by fear and indecision. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and the rest stop filled up with travelers and truckers, all of them going about their lives oblivious to the hell I was living in. Finally, I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that rest stop forever. I had to keep moving, even if I didn't know where I was headed. 3 days passed before Rita called me again. I'd spent those days holed up in my apartment, drinking cheap whiskey and staring at the trooper's business card. I must have picked it up 100 times, ready to dial the number, but each time I'd set it back down and pour myself another drink. The walls of my apartment felt like they were pressing in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every car that drove by, every footstep in the hallway outside my door, made my heart race. When Rita's call finally came, I almost didn't answer. I saw her name on the screen and felt my stomach drop. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail to pretend I wasn't home to buy myself a little more time. But I knew that would only make things worse. I answered on the 4th ring and tried to keep my voice steady. Rita told me there was another job and that it needed to happen tonight. She said the client was getting impatient and that they needed me specifically. I asked her why me, and she got quiet for a moment before telling me it was because I'd proven myself reliable. Reliable. The word made me want to throw my phone across the room. I wasn't reliable, I was trapped. There was a difference. But I didn't say any of that to Rita. I just told her I'd be at the warehouse by 8 and hung up. I sat there on my couch staring at nothing, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I thought about the trooper's offer and about what would happen if I took it. Witness protection. Maybe a new identity somewhere far away from Arizona. It sounded almost too good to be true, and in my experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. But I also thought about what would happen if I kept doing these runs. Eventually, the law would catch up with me, or Saul Everman's people would decide I was a liability. Either way, I'd end up dead or in prison. The only question was which would come first. I pulled out the business card and stared at it for what felt like the 100th time. The trooper's name was printed in small black letters, and underneath it was a phone number and an email address. I memorized both, and then I tore the card into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet. I didn't call him, not yet. I needed more time to think, to figure out what my play was going to be. I grabbed my keys and headed out to my truck. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning that same orange color it had been on my first run to Phoenix. It felt like a lifetime ago, even though it had only been a few months. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The familiar rumble of the diesel motor was oddly comforting, and for a moment I let myself pretend that this was just another normal job. The drive to Tucson took about 2 hours, and I spent most of it in silence. I didn't turn on the radio, and I didn't let my mind wander. I just focused on the road ahead, watching the white lines blur past in the headlights. When I finally pulled into the warehouse district, it was fully dark. The streets were empty, and the only light came from a few scattered street lamps that cast long shadows across the pavement. I backed my truck up to the loading dock and killed the engine. Saul Everman was waiting for me just like he always was. He stepped out of the shadows as I climbed down from the cab and gave me that same cold smile. He asked me how I'd been, and I told him fine. He nodded like he believed me, but I could see in his eyes that he knew I was lying. He led me into the warehouse, and I followed him past the same 2 silent men who were already loading the pallets onto my trailer. I watched them work their movements efficient and practiced like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Saul Everman handed me the clipboard, and I signed my name without reading the paperwork. He told me the delivery address was different this time, that I'd be heading to a location just outside of Phoenix near the foothills. He said there would be someone waiting for me there, and that I should follow their instructions exactly. I nodded and climbed back into my truck. As I pulled out of the lot, I saw Saul Everman standing in the doorway watching me leave. His silhouette was backlit by the fluorescent lights of the warehouse, and for a moment he looked almost like a statue, cold and unmoving. I merged onto the highway and headed north. The road was mostly empty at that hour, just a few semis and passenger cars scattered across the lanes. I kept my speed steady and tried not to think about what was in my trailer. I'd learned over the past few months that ignorance was easier than knowledge. If I didn't know exactly what I was hauling, then I could pretend it was something less sinister than I suspected. It was a lie I told myself, but it was the only thing that kept me sane. About an hour into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was just another truck, but as the miles passed, I realized it was staying with me, keeping the same distance no matter how fast or slow I went. My pulse quickened and I felt that familiar sense of dread settle over me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew better. I'd been followed before, and this felt the same. I took an exit off the highway, hoping to lose whoever was behind me. The exit led to a small 2-lane road that cut through the desert. The headlights followed me off the highway and stayed on my tail. I sped up, pushing the truck faster than I should have on the narrow road. The headlights sped up too. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about pulling over and confronting whoever was following me, but I knew that was a bad idea. The road twisted through the desert for several miles before reconnecting with the highway. I merged back onto the interstate and the headlights followed. I was starting to panic now, my mind racing through possibilities. Was it the police? Was it Saul Everman's people checking up on me? Or was it someone else entirely, someone I hadn't even considered? I reached for my phone, thinking I'd call Rita, or maybe even the trooper, but before I could dial, the headlights suddenly accelerated and pulled up alongside me. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. The car paced me for a moment, and then the passenger window rolled down. I couldn't see who was inside, but I heard a voice yell something I couldn't make out over the roar of the engines. The sedan swerved closer to me, forcing me toward the shoulder. I jerked the wheel to the right, barely avoiding a collision. The sedan pulled back and then accelerated ahead of me, cutting me off and forcing me to hit my brakes. I slowed down to a crawl, and the sedan matched my speed, staying just ahead of me. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what they wanted. Were they trying to steal the cargo? Were they trying to scare me? Or were they trying to do something worse? The sedan's brake lights flashed, and it slowed down even more, forcing me to come to a complete stop. I sat there in the middle of the highway with my hazards on, watching as the sedan's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She walked toward my truck with a confidence that made me uneasy. I rolled down my window as she approached, and she stopped a few feet away. She told me her name was Clara June Blevins, and that she needed to talk to me. I asked her what she wanted, and she glanced over her shoulder before looking back at me. She said she knew what I was hauling, and she knew who I was working for. She said she'd been watching me for weeks, trying to figure out the best way to approach me. I felt my blood run cold. If she'd been watching me, that meant she knew where I lived, where I went, what I did. I asked her who she was, and she smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. She said she was someone who could help me if I was smart enough to listen. Clara June Blevins told me she was a federal investigator working undercover to bring down the smuggling operation I'd gotten caught up in. She said she knew about Saul Everman and the warehouse and the deliveries. She said they had enough evidence to shut the whole thing down, but they needed someone on the inside, someone who could testify about what they'd seen. She said if I cooperated, they could protect me, put me in witness protection, and make sure I didn't do any prison time. It was the same offer the trooper had made, but hearing it from her made it feel more real somehow. I asked her how I could trust her, and she reached into her jacket and pulled out a badge. She held it up for me to see, and I squinted at it in the dim light. It looked legitimate, but I wasn't sure. I'd heard stories about people impersonating federal agents, and I didn't know if this was one of those situations. Clara June Blevins must have sensed my hesitation because she told me I didn't have to decide right now. She said I should think about it and call her when I was ready. She handed me a business card and told me to be careful. She said the people I was working for were dangerous and that they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone they saw as a threat. Then she walked back to her sedan and drove off, leaving me sitting there in the middle of the highway. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. 2 law enforcement officers had now approached me with the same offer. That meant they were serious about bringing down Saul Everman and his operation, but it also meant I was caught in the middle of something much bigger than I'd realized. I thought about the cargo in my trailer and about all the runs I'd made over the past few months. I thought about the money I'd been paid and about how none of it had been worth the cost. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. The rest of the drive to Phoenix was uneventful. I followed the directions Saul Everman had given me and ended up at a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city. There were 2 men waiting for me, and they unloaded the cargo quickly and efficiently. One of them handed me an envelope, and I didn't bother counting the cash inside. I just shoved it in my pocket and climbed back into my truck. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the parking lot staring at Clara June Blevins' business card. I thought about calling her right then, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was exhausted and confused, and I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. I went inside and collapsed on my couch. I didn't bother taking off my boots or turning on the lights. I just lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what I was going to do. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was Rita. She told me there was another job and that it needed to happen that night. I felt a surge of anger and frustration. I told her I needed a break, that I'd been doing too many runs, and I needed some time off. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me that wasn't possible. She said the client had specifically requested me and that refusing wasn't an option. I started to argue, but she cut me off. She said if I didn't show up tonight, there would be consequences, and then she hung up. I sat there holding my phone, feeling the walls close in around me. I knew what those consequences would be. Saul Everman had made it clear from the beginning what happened to people who didn't cooperate. I thought about running about packing a bag and getting as far away from Arizona as I could. But I also knew that wouldn't work. These people had resources and connections I couldn't begin to compete with. If I ran, they'd find me eventually. I pulled out Clara June Blevins' business card and stared at it. I thought about what she'd said about witness protection and starting over somewhere new. It sounded like a dream, like something that happened to other people, not to someone like me. But I was running out of options. I could keep doing these runs and hope I didn't get caught or killed, or I could take the chance and trust that the feds could protect me. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on the card. It rang 3 times before Clara June Blevins answered. I told her who I was and that I was ready to talk. She said she'd been waiting for my call and that we needed to meet somewhere safe. She gave me an address and told me to come alone. I said I would and hung up. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I didn't know what would happen once I met with Clara June Blevins, but I knew my life was about to change in ways I couldn't predict. I thought about the choices I'd made and the roads I'd taken that had led me here. I thought about my old man David and what he would have said if he'd known what I'd gotten myself into. He'd always told me to do the right thing even when it was hard. I'd ignored that advice for a long time, but maybe it wasn't too late to start listening. That evening, I drove to the address Clara June Blevins had given me. It was a small office building in a quiet part of Phoenix. I parked my truck and walked inside. The lobby was empty except for a security guard who barely looked up as I passed. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found the office number she'd given me. I knocked on the door and waited. Clara June Blevins opened the door and gestured for me to come in. The office was small and sparsely furnished with just a desk and a couple of chairs. There was another person in the room, a man in a suit who introduced himself as a federal prosecutor. He shook my hand and told me to sit down. I did, and Clara June Blevins sat across from me. She told me they were going to ask me some questions and that I should answer them honestly. She said everything I told them would be used to build a case against Saul Everman and his associates. I spent the next 3 hours telling them everything. I told them about the first run, and about Saul Everman, and about the men in the black SUV. I told them about the pallets and the money, and about Rita and the phone calls. I told them about the warehouse and the deliveries, and about the nights I'd spent lying awake wondering if I was going to end up dead or in prison. I told them everything I could remember, and when I was done, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The prosecutor told me I'd done the right thing and that they would do everything they could to protect me. He said they'd need me to make one more delivery so they could catch Saul Everman and his people in the act. He said they'd be watching the entire time and that I'd be safe. I didn't believe him, but I didn't have a choice. I'd already committed to cooperating, and backing out now would only make things worse. Clara June Blevins walked me to the elevator and told me to be careful. She said Saul Everman was smart and that if he suspected anything, he wouldn't hesitate to act. She told me to call her if anything felt wrong and that they'd pull me out immediately. I nodded and got on the elevator. As the doors closed, I saw her standing there watching me, and I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. I drove back to my apartment and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about the delivery I'd have to make and about what would happen if something went wrong. I thought about Saul Everman and the way he looked at me like he could see right through me. I thought about the men in the black SUV and about what they'd do if they found out I was working with the feds. The next evening, I drove to the warehouse in Tucson. Saul Everman was waiting for me like always. He greeted me with that same cold smile and handed me the clipboard. I signed my name and watched as the two silent men loaded the pallets onto my trailer. Everything felt the same as it always had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, that Saul Everman knew what I'd done. As I climbed into my truck, Saul Everman leaned in through the window. He told me this was an important delivery and that I needed to be extra careful. He said there had been some problems lately and that they were watching everyone more closely. My heart started racing and I felt sweat bead on my forehead. I asked him what kind of problems, and he just smiled. He said I shouldn't worry about it, that as long as I did my job, everything would be fine. I pulled out of the lot and headed north toward Phoenix. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see Saul Everman's car following me or the black SUV pulling up alongside me. But the road stayed empty. Clara, June Blevins had said they'd be watching, but I couldn't see any sign of them. I felt completely alone, like I was walking a tightrope with no net to catch me if I fell. About halfway to Phoenix, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer. But something told me I should, so I picked up. It was Saul Everman. He told me to pull over at the next exit, that there'd been a change of plans. My blood went cold and I felt my hands start to shake. I asked him what was going on, and he said he'd explain when I got there. Then he hung up. I didn't know what to do. If I pulled over, I'd be walking into a trap. But if I didn't, Saul Everman would know something was wrong. I thought about calling Clara June Blevins, but I didn't have time. The exit was coming up fast and I had to make a decision. I took a deep breath and pulled off the highway. The exit ramp curved away from the highway and led to a frontage road that ran parallel to the interstate. There were no streetlights and the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of my headlights. I drove slowly, looking for any sign of where I was supposed to go. My phone rang again, and I answered it without taking my eyes off the road. Saul Everman told me to take the next left and follow it for about a mile. He said I'd see a dirt road on the right and that I should pull in there and wait. I asked him again what was going on, but he'd already hung up. I took the left turn and found myself on a narrow 2-lane road that cut through empty desert. There were no buildings, no signs of life, just scrub brush and rocks stretching out into the darkness. I drove for what felt like forever, checking my odometer and watching the tenths of a mile tick by. When I hit the 1-mile mark, I started looking for the dirt road. I almost missed it. It was barely more than a pair of tire tracks cutting through the brush, and if I hadn't been looking for it, I would have driven right past. I turned onto the dirt road and immediately regretted it. The truck bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, and I had to slow to a crawl to keep from bottoming out. The road wound through the desert for maybe a quarter mile before opening into a small clearing. I pulled to a stop and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No highway noise, no wind, nothing. Just the ticking of the cooling engine and the sound of my own breathing. I sat there waiting and trying to calm my racing heart. I thought about calling Clara June Blevins, but I didn't want to risk it. If Saul Everman was watching, he'd see me on the phone and know something was wrong. I looked around, trying to see if there were any other vehicles or any sign of what I was supposed to be waiting for, but the darkness was too thick. I couldn't see more than 20 feet beyond the reach of my headlights. After about 5 minutes, I saw headlights approaching from the direction I'd come. A vehicle pulled into the clearing and stopped about 30 feet from my truck. It was a pickup truck, and I could see two figures sitting in the cab. The driver's side door opened, and Saul Everman stepped out. He walked toward my truck, and I rolled down the window. He asked me if I'd had any trouble finding the place, and I told him no. He nodded and told me to get out of the truck. I climbed down and stood there trying to read his expression. He looked calm, almost relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. He told me there'd been a change in the delivery location, that the people we were supposed to meet had moved to a different spot. He said we needed to transfer the cargo to his truck and that he'd take it the rest of the way. I asked him why, and he said it was safer this way, that there had been some heat from law enforcement and they were being extra cautious. My mind was racing. This wasn't part of the plan. Clara June Blevins had said I'd make the delivery and that they'd move in once the exchange was complete. If Saul Everman took the cargo now, the whole operation would fall apart. I told him I didn't understand why we couldn't just continue with the original plan, and he stepped closer to me. He said it wasn't a request, that I needed to do what I was told. The second figure from the pickup truck got out, and I recognized him as one of the silent men from the warehouse. They walked to the back of my trailer, and I followed. Saul Everman told me to open it, and I did. The two of them climbed inside and started pulling the pallets toward the edge. I stood there watching them work and trying to figure out what to do. If I let them take the cargo, I'd have nothing to show the feds. But if I tried to stop them, Saul Everman would know I was working against him. I felt trapped, like no matter what I did, I was going to lose. That's when I heard the sound of more vehicles approaching. Headlights appeared on the dirt road, and within seconds the clearing was flooded with light. 3 SUVs pulled in, surrounding us and blocking any possible escape route. Doors opened, and people started pouring out, all of them wearing jackets with large letters printed on the back. DEA, FBI, Border Patrol. Saul Everman froze, and I saw his hand move toward his waistband, but he stopped himself. The silent man dropped the pallet he was holding and raised his hands. Clara June Blevins stepped forward from one of the SUVs. She was wearing a tactical vest and holding a pistol. She shouted for everyone to get on the ground, and Saul Everman complied, slowly lowering himself to his knees with his hands behind his head. I stood there, not sure what I was supposed to do. One of the agents grabbed me and pushed me against the side of my truck. He told me not to move, and I nodded. I watched as they cuffed Saul Everman and the other man and read them their rights. Clara June Blevins walked over to me and told me I'd done good. She said they'd gotten everything they needed, and that Saul Everman and his associates would be going away for a long time. I asked her what would happen to me, and she said they'd keep their end of the bargain. She said I'd be placed in witness protection and given a new identity. She said it would take a few weeks to process everything, but that in the meantime I'd be kept in a safe house where no one could get to me. They took Saul Everman and the other man away, and several agents started unloading the cargo from my trailer. Clara. June Blevins told me to get in one of the SUVs, and I did. We drove back to Phoenix in silence. I sat in the back seat staring out the window and trying to process everything that had just happened. I'd spent months living in fear, and now it was over. Or at least I thought it was over. They took me to a hotel on the outskirts of the city. It was a cheap place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign, but Clara. June Blevins said it would only be temporary. She gave me a room key and told me to stay inside until someone came to get me. She said there would be agents watching the building and that I'd be safe. I went up to the room and locked the door behind me. The room was small and musty, with a sagging bed and a television that only got 3 channels. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Over the next few days, I stayed in that hotel room waiting for someone to tell me what was going to happen next. Agents came by periodically to check on me and bring me food, but nobody gave me any real information. I tried calling Clara June Blevins, but her number went straight to voicemail. I tried calling the prosecutor I'd met with, but got the same result. I started to feel like I'd been forgotten, like they'd gotten what they needed from me, and now I was just an inconvenience. On the fourth day, there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. He was wearing a suit and holding a badge. I opened the door, and he introduced himself as an agent with the Marshal Service. He said they were ready to move me into witness protection, and that I needed to pack up whatever I had. I told him I didn't have anything, and he nodded. He said we'd be leaving immediately and that I should follow him. We walked down to the parking lot and got into an unmarked sedan. The agent didn't say much during the drive, just told me that we were going to a processing center where they'd set me up with new documents and a new identity. I asked him where I'd be going, and he said he couldn't tell me that yet. He said it was for my own safety that the fewer people who knew where I was, the better. The processing center was a nondescript building in an industrial area. We went inside, and I was led to a small office where another agent was waiting. She asked me a series of questions about my background, my family, my work history. She told me they'd be creating a complete new identity for me and that I'd have to leave everything from my old life behind. I asked if I'd ever be able to contact anyone from my past, and she shook her head. She said that wasn't possible, that doing so would compromise my safety. Over the next week, I went through the process of becoming someone else. They gave me a new name, new social security number, new driver's license. They set me up with a bank account and a job in a city I'd never been to. They gave me a small apartment and told me to keep a low profile. They said someone would check in on me periodically, but that otherwise I'd be on my own. When it was finally time to leave, they drove me to the airport and put me on a plane. I didn't know where I was going until I was already in the air. The city they'd chosen was small and quiet, nothing like the places I was used to. When I arrived, I took a cab to the address they'd given me and found a one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place was furnished, but barely. A couch, a table, a bed. The bare minimum. I spent the first few weeks in my new city trying to adjust to my new life. I started my new job working at a warehouse loading trucks. It was ironic in a way that I'd spent years driving trucks, and now I was loading them. The work was hard and the pay was terrible, but I kept my head down and did what I was told. I didn't make friends, and I didn't talk to anyone more than I had to. I was living in a kind of limbo, caught between who I used to be and who I was supposed to be now. But the thing about running from your past is that it never really goes away. No matter how far you go or how much you try to forget, it's always there, lurking in the back of your mind. I started having nightmares about Saul Everman, about the warehouse, about the runs I'd made through the desert. I'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced that someone was coming for me. I'd get up and check the locks on the door and look out the window at the empty parking lot below. One night, about 3 months after I'd been relocated, I came home from work and found an envelope taped to my door. There was no name on it, no return address. I took it inside and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me walking out of the warehouse where I worked. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, maybe from a parked car. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 4 words in neat block letters. "We know where you are." I stood there staring at the photograph, feeling my blood run cold. I grabbed my phone and called the number the marshals had given me for emergencies. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I called again and got the same result. I tried Clara June Blevins' number, but it was disconnected. I tried the prosecutor and got a message saying the number was no longer in service. It was like everyone I'd dealt with had vanished. I spent that night sitting on my couch with all the lights off, staring at the door and waiting for it to burst open. But nothing happened. The night passed slowly, and when the sun finally came up, I was still sitting there. I didn't go to work that day. I stayed in my apartment trying to figure out what to do. I thought about running about packing a bag and disappearing again, but I knew that wouldn't work. If they'd found me, once they could find me again. Over the next few days, I kept waiting for something to happen. I expected to find another photograph, or to see someone following me, or to come home and find my apartment ransacked. But nothing happened. Everything stayed quiet and normal. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress and paranoia had finally gotten to me. But the photograph was real. I kept it hidden in a drawer, and every few days I'd take it out and look at it, just to remind myself that it wasn't my imagination. Weeks turned into months, and I fell into a routine. I went to work. I came home. I ate dinner. I went to bed. I stopped checking over my shoulder every few minutes, and I stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. I started to relax, to believe that maybe the photograph had been a warning and nothing more. Maybe whoever had found me had decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe they'd moved on to bigger problems. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I knew that the people I'd crossed didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. I knew that someday, somewhere, they'd come for me. It might be tomorrow, or it might be years from now, but it would happen. That's the price I paid for the choices I made. I traded my old life for a new one, but the debt was still there waiting to be collected. I still drive sometimes, not for work, just to clear my head. I'll get in my car and take long drives through empty roads late at night. It reminds me of my time as a trucker, of the freedom I felt behind the wheel. But it also reminds me of that night in the desert, of Saul Everman's cold smile, and of the cargo I hauled without asking questions. Those memories never leave me, no matter how far I drive or how fast I go. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Saul Everman, if he's sitting in a prison cell somewhere thinking about the operation that fell apart. I wonder if he knows it was me who brought it all down, or if he thinks it was just bad luck. I wonder if he sent people looking for me, or if he's forgotten about me entirely. I'll probably never know the answer to those questions. What I do know is that I'm not Wendell Kirkland anymore. That person died the night I got on that plane and flew to a city I'd never heard of. The person I am now is someone else entirely, someone with a different name and a different history. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I forget which person I'm supposed to be. I forget if the memories I have are real, or if they belong to someone who doesn't exist anymore. I keep the photograph hidden in my apartment. I don't know why I haven't thrown it away. Maybe it's because it's the only proof I have that my old life was real, that I didn't just dream the whole thing up. Or maybe it's because I want to remember what happens when you make a deal with the devil. You might get what you want in the moment, but eventually the bill comes due. I think about that first run a lot. I think about how I could have said no to Rita, how I could have walked away when Saul Everman gave me that cold smile. I think about all the choices I made that led me to this point, and I wonder if things could have turned out differently. But the truth is, I'll never know. The past is the past, and there's no changing it. All I can do is keep moving forward and hope that the people looking for me never find what they're searching for. Last week, I came home and found my apartment door slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to decide if I should go inside or run. Eventually, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was missing. But I could feel it. Someone had been there. The air felt different somehow, like the space had been disturbed. I searched every room, but I couldn't find anything. No note, no photograph, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew. I could feel it in my bones. They'd found me again, and this time they'd been inside. This time they'd gotten close. I thought about calling the marshals again, but I knew there was no point. They'd made it clear that I was on my own now that they'd done their part, and the rest was up to me. So I keep living my life. I go to work, I come home, I eat dinner, I go to bed. I try not to think about the photograph or the door left ajar, or the feeling that I'm being watched. I try to convince myself that I'm safe, that the people looking for me will eventually give up and move on. But I know that's not true. I know that one day I'll come home and find something worse than a photograph. One day, they'll stop sending warnings, and they'll come to collect what they think I owe them. Until then, I'll keep driving. I'll keep taking those long late-night drives through empty roads, pretending for a few hours that I'm still Wendell Kirkland, the trucker who thought he could make some easy money without asking questions. I'll pretend that I'm still the person I used to be before I hauled that first load from Tucson to Phoenix. I'll pretend that I still have a choice about how this story ends. But the truth is, my story ended the night I signed that clipboard in Saul Everman's warehouse. Everything that's happened since then has just been the epilogue, and I don't know how long epilogues are supposed to last, or what happens when they finally run out of pages. All I know is that I'm still here, I'm still breathing, and for now, that's enough. My name is Virgil Tanner, and I've been hauling freight across the Southwest for the better part of 8 years. I've driven through every kind of weather you can imagine: blizzards in Colorado, dust storms in Arizona, ice storms in the Panhandle. I've seen roadside accidents that would turn your stomach, and I've passed stranded motorists in places so remote you'd think they were on another planet. In all that time, I'd never needed help myself. I'd always been the one doing the helping, or at least driving past and calling it in. That changed one night in West Texas on a stretch of highway so empty it might as well have been the surface of the moon. It was late September, and I was hauling a load of construction materials from El Paso to Albuquerque. The route took me through some of the most desolate country in the lower 48, nothing but flat desert scrubland for miles in every direction. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and the darkness out there was absolute. No towns, no gas stations, no lights of any kind. Just the narrow cone of my headlights cutting through the blackness and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out ahead of me. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight, and I was starting to feel it. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was having trouble keeping my focus on the road. I'd drunk 2 energy drinks and chewed through half a pack of gum, but nothing seemed to help. I was debating whether to pull over and catch a few hours of sleep when I felt the truck shudder beneath me. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration in the steering wheel, but within seconds it had turned into a violent shaking that made my teeth rattle. I eased off the gas and the shaking got worse. The engine started making a grinding noise that I'd never heard before, a deep metallic screech that set my nerves on edge. I knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. I'd maintained that truck religiously changed the oil, checked the fluids, inspected the belts and hoses. There was no reason for it to be breaking down, but here we were. I guided the truck onto the shoulder and came to a stop. The engine coughed twice and then died completely. I sat there in the sudden silence, feeling my heart pound in my chest. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the faint whistle of wind outside. I turned the key, trying to restart the engine, but nothing happened. Not even a click. The dashboard lights flickered and went dark. I tried again with the same result. The truck was completely dead. I pulled out my phone and checked for signal. Nothing. I held it up near the windshield and moved it around, hoping to catch even one bar, but the screen stayed blank. No service. I knew I was in trouble. I was at least 40 miles from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The temperature outside was still in the 90s even after sunset, and I only had 2 bottles of water in the cab. I could walk, but I'd be doing it in the dark across open desert with no guarantee I'd find help before I collapsed from heat exhaustion. The smart thing to do was stay with the truck and wait for someone to come along. Sooner or later, another trucker would pass by, and I could flag them down. I climbed out of the cab and walked around to the front of the truck. I popped the hood and looked at the engine, but I couldn't see much in the darkness. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight function to get a better look. Everything seemed normal. No obvious leaks, no loose belts, no smoking wires. Whatever had gone wrong was internal something I couldn't fix on the side of the road with the limited tools I had. I slammed the hood shut and leaned against the truck trying to figure out my next move. That's when I saw the lights. They were far off in the distance, maybe a mile or two away, just a faint glow on the horizon. At first I thought it might be a town, but as I watched I realized the lights weren't stationary. They were moving slowly, crossing the desert in a direction roughly parallel to the highway. I couldn't tell what they were, headlights maybe, or work lights from some kind of mining operation. Whatever they were, they represented people, and people meant help. I grabbed my water bottles and a flashlight from the cab and started walking. The lights were off to the north, which meant I'd have to leave the highway and cross open desert to reach them. It wasn't an ideal situation, but I didn't have many options. I could stay with the truck and hope someone came along, or I could take my chances and try to reach those lights. I chose the latter. I climbed over the guardrail and started walking into the darkness. The ground was rough and uneven, covered in rocks and scrub brush that caught at my boots. I kept my flashlight pointed at the ground, trying to avoid stepping on anything that might twist my ankle or worse. The air was still hot and dry, and within minutes I was sweating through my shirt. I took a sip from one of my water bottles and kept walking. The lights ahead of me seemed to be getting closer, but it was hard to tell in the darkness. Distance out here was deceptive. What looked like a mile could turn out to be 3 or 4. I walked for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes. The lights were definitely closer now, and I could make out individual points of illumination. It looked like there were 3 or 4 light sources spread out across a small area. As I got closer, I started to see shapes, buildings maybe, or vehicles. I felt a surge of relief. Whoever these people were, they'd have a phone or a radio. They could call a tow truck or at least give me a ride back to civilization. I was maybe 200 yards away when I realized the lights were coming from a house. It was a small single-story structure with a pitched roof and a covered porch. There were lights on inside, and a pickup truck parked out front. Behind the house, I could see what looked like a barn or a storage shed. The whole place had a makeshift quality to it, like it had been thrown together from salvaged materials. I couldn't imagine why anyone would choose to live out here miles from the nearest town with no visible road leading to the property. I approached the house cautiously. Something about the place made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe it was just the isolation or the late hour, but I felt like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. I walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a moment nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps inside, heavy and deliberate. The door opened, and a man stood there looking at me. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and pale eyes that seemed to reflect the light from inside the house. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hands were rough and calloused, and there was dirt under his fingernails. He looked me up and down without saying anything, and I felt a chill run through me despite the heat. There was something off about him, something predatory in the way he studied me. I told him my truck had broken down on the highway and that I needed to use a phone. He didn't respond right away, just stood there staring at me. Finally, he stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. I hesitated for a moment, but I didn't have much choice. I needed help, and this was the only place for miles. I stepped through the door and into the house. The interior was dimly lit with just a few lamps casting weak yellow light across the room. The walls were bare wood, and the floor was covered in scuffed linoleum. There was a couch against one wall and a small kitchen area in the back. Everything looked old and worn, like it had been used hard for many years. The air smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in a long time. The man closed the door behind me, and I heard the click of a lock. He introduced himself as Ephra Holiday and said this was his ranch. I looked around, but I didn't see any signs of ranching, no saddles or ropes or feed bags. The place looked more like a hideout than a working ranch. Ephra Holiday asked me what had happened, and I explained about my truck breaking down. He nodded slowly and said he didn't have a phone, but that he could drive me to the nearest town in the morning. I asked him why not tonight, and he said it was too dangerous to drive in the dark, that there were arroyos and gullies that could swallow a truck whole if you weren't careful. I didn't like that answer, but I couldn't argue with it. I asked if I could at least borrow his truck to drive myself back to the highway, and he shook his head. He said the truck was low on fuel and that he couldn't spare it. He told me I was welcome to spend the night and that we'd head out first thing in the morning. I thanked him and tried to hide my unease. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Ephra Holiday told me to have a seat and disappeared into the back of the house. I sat down on the couch and looked around. There were no pictures on the walls, no personal items of any kind. The place felt temporary, like whoever lived here didn't plan on staying long. I heard voices coming from the back of the house, low and urgent. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like an argument. After a few minutes, Ephra Holiday came back into the room. He was carrying a glass of water, which he handed to me. I thanked him and took a sip. The water was lukewarm and had a faintly metallic taste. He sat down in a chair across from me and folded his hands in his lap. He asked me where I was headed, and I told him Albuquerque. He nodded and asked what I was hauling. I told him construction materials. He seemed to consider this for a moment and then asked if I was married. The question caught me off guard, and I said no. He asked if I had family, and I said, not really. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We sat in silence for a while. I could feel him watching me, and it made my skin crawl. I asked him how long he'd lived out here, and he said a few years. I asked him what he did for a living, and he said he raised cattle, though I hadn't seen any sign of livestock. He said the cattle were on the far side of the property, and that he kept them away from the house. I nodded, but I didn't believe him. Everything about this place screamed wrong. That's when I heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. A door opened, and a woman stepped into the room. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and a thin frame. She was wearing a faded dress that looked too big for her, and her feet were bare. She glanced at me and then quickly looked away. Ephra Holiday introduced her as his daughter, Marlene Ray Tanner. I said hello, but she didn't respond. She just stood there with her head down, like she was afraid to look at me. Ephra Holiday told Marlene Ray Tanner to fix me something to eat. She nodded and hurried into the kitchen area. I watched her move around the small space, and I noticed she was limping slightly. There was a bruise on her arm just above her elbow, dark purple against her pale skin. She didn't look at me or her father, just kept her eyes on what she was doing. She pulled out a frying pan and started cooking something on the stove. The smell of burning grease filled the room. I asked Ephra Holiday if there was a bathroom I could use, and he pointed toward a hallway. I stood up and walked in that direction. The hallway was narrow and dark, with just one door at the end. I opened it and found a small bathroom with a toilet and a sink. There was no shower, and the fixtures were old and stained. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts. Something was very wrong here, and I needed to figure out what. I looked around the bathroom, searching for anything that might tell me more about this place. There was nothing unusual, just a bar of soap and a threadbare towel hanging from a hook. I opened the medicine cabinet and found a few bottles of prescription medication. I couldn't read the labels in the dim light, but I pocketed one of the bottles thinking it might be useful later. I flushed the toilet and ran the water in the sink for a minute to make it sound like I'd actually used the bathroom. Then I opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. As I was walking back toward the main room, I heard voices again coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I stopped and listened. It was Aoife Holliday and Marlene Ray Tanner, and they were arguing. I couldn't make out most of what they were saying, but I caught a few words. One of them was stranger. Another was problem. And then I heard Aoife Holliday say something that made my blood run cold. He said, "We can't let him leave." I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard. Had I misheard? Maybe he'd said something else, something that sounded like what I thought I'd heard. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Aoife Holliday was planning to keep me here, and I had no idea why. I thought about running about, making a break for the door, and trying to get back to my truck. But I was miles from the highway with no phone and no way to call for help. If Aoife Holliday came after me, I wouldn't stand a chance. I walked back into the main room, trying to act normal. Aoife Holliday was sitting in his chair, and he looked up when I entered. He asked if everything was okay, and I said yes. Marlene Ray Tanner had finished cooking, and she brought me a plate of food. It was eggs and some kind of meat I couldn't identify. I thanked her, and she scurried back to the kitchen. I sat down and forced myself to eat, even though I'd lost my appetite. I needed to keep up appearances at least until I could figure out a way to get out of here. Aoife Holliday watched me eat. He didn't say anything, just sat there with that same cold expression on his face. I tried to make small talk, asking him about the ranch and the surrounding area, but his answers were short and vague. He seemed distracted, like he was thinking about something else. I finished eating and set the plate down on a small table next to the couch. I told him I was tired and asked if there was somewhere I could sleep. He stood up and told me to follow him. We walked down the hallway past the bathroom to another door. He opened it and showed me a small bedroom with a single bed and a dresser. There was a window on the far wall, but it was covered with boards. He said I could sleep here and that he'd wake me in the morning. I thanked him, and he left, closing the door behind him. I heard the click of a lock and realized he'd locked me in. I sat down on the bed and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I was trapped in a house in the middle of nowhere with a man who clearly had no intention of helping me. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was planning, but I knew I needed to get out of here before morning. I stood up and walked over to the window. I tried pulling on the boards, but they were nailed tight. I couldn't budge them without making noise, and I didn't want to alert Aoife Holliday to what I was doing. I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The dresser was empty, except for a few old blankets. There was nothing under the bed. I checked my pockets and found my phone, my wallet, and the pill bottle I'd taken from the bathroom. None of it would be much use in a fight. I sat back down on the bed and tried to think. There had to be a way out of here. I just needed to figure out what it was. I lay down on the bed and pretended to sleep. I could hear movement in the house, footsteps, and muffled voices. I waited until everything went quiet, and then I got up and pressed my ear against the door. I couldn't hear anything. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked from the outside. I looked around the room again, searching for something I'd missed. That's when I noticed a small vent near the ceiling. It was maybe a foot square, covered with a metal grate. I pulled the dresser over to the wall and climbed on top of it. I reached up and tried to pry the grate loose. It was screwed in place, but the screws were old and rusty. I used the edge of my belt buckle to turn them slowly and quietly. It took almost 10 minutes, but eventually I got all 4 screws out. I pulled the grate free and looked into the vent. It was dark and narrow, but it looked like it might lead somewhere. I didn't know where the vent went, or if I'd even fit inside, but I didn't have any other options. I pulled myself up and squeezed into the opening. The metal walls pressed against my shoulders and I had to turn sideways to make any progress. I crawled forward slowly, trying not to make any noise. The vent seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the walls of the house. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, and I had to feel my way forward with my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I saw light ahead. I crawled toward it and found another vent opening. I looked through the grate and saw I was above the main room. Afra Holliday was sitting in his chair with his back to me. Marlene Ray Tanner was standing near the kitchen, and she was crying. Afra Holliday was saying something to her, but I couldn't make out the words. Then he stood up and walked toward her. I watched as he grabbed her arm roughly and pulled her close. She tried to pull away, but he held her tight. I felt sick watching this. I wanted to do something to help her, but I was trapped in a vent with no way to get down. I kept crawling, hoping to find another way out. The vent continued through the ceiling and into another part of the house. I came to another opening and looked down. This one opened into what looked like a storage room. There were boxes stacked against the walls and tools hanging from hooks. And in the center of the room there was something that made my heart stop. It was a large chest freezer, the kind you'd use to store meat or vegetables. But the lid was open, and inside I could see something that wasn't food. It was a body, or at least part of one, wrapped in plastic and frozen solid. I couldn't see much detail from where I was, but I could make out the shape of a human form. I felt bile rise in my throat, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. I backed away from the vent opening and kept crawling. I needed to get out of this house, and I needed to do it now. The vent branched off in two directions, and I chose the one that seemed to lead toward the outside wall. I crawled as fast as I could, my hands and knees scraping against the metal. Finally, I saw another opening ahead, this one larger than the others. I crawled toward it and found myself looking out into the night air. The vent opened onto the side of the house near the roof. I squeezed through the opening and dropped down onto the porch below. The fall was only about 6 feet, but I landed hard and pain shot through my ankle. I bit back a cry and got to my feet. I could hear movement inside the house, voices raised in alarm. Ephra Holliday had realized I was gone. I ran into the darkness with no plan and no direction, just pure survival instinct driving me forward. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I pushed through the pain. Behind me, I could hear the front door of the house slam open and Ephra Holliday's voice shouting into the night. I didn't look back. I just kept running, stumbling over rocks and brush as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and that house. The desert at night is disorienting. Without the sun to give you bearings, everything looks the same, just endless darkness broken up by the occasional silhouette of a cactus or scrub bush. I had no idea which direction I was heading. I thought I was running toward the highway, but I could have been going parallel to it or even away from it. My only goal was to get away from Ephra Holliday and whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. I'd been running for maybe 5 minutes when I heard the sound of an engine starting. I glanced back and saw headlights piercing the darkness. The pickup truck. Ephra Holliday was coming after me. I changed direction, trying to head toward rougher terrain where a vehicle couldn't follow. My lungs were burning and my injured ankle was screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. If he caught me, I knew I'd end up in that freezer. The headlights swept across the desert searching for me. I dropped to the ground behind a cluster of rocks and tried to control my breathing. The truck was moving slowly, methodically, covering the area in a grid pattern. I could hear the engine getting closer, and I pressed myself flat against the ground, praying he wouldn't see me. The headlights passed over my hiding spot, and for a moment I was fully illuminated. I held my breath, waiting for the truck to stop, but it kept moving. He hadn't seen me. I waited until the truck had moved past, and then I got up and started running again. This time I angled more sharply to the right, trying to circle back toward where I thought the highway might be. My sense of direction was completely shot, and I had no way to orient myself. The stars were out, but I'd never been good at navigation by constellation. I just kept moving, hoping I'd stumble across the road or see headlights from a passing vehicle. After another 10 minutes of running, I had to stop. My body was giving out. I bent over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air. My throat was raw, and my mouth tasted like copper. I dropped my water bottles back at the house, and I was already desperately thirsty. I looked around trying to find some kind of landmark or reference point, but everything looked the same. I was lost in the middle of the desert with a killer hunting me and no way to call for help. I heard the truck again. It sounded farther away now, like Ephra Holiday had moved his search to a different area. I took advantage of the distance and started walking. Running was no longer an option. My ankle had swollen inside my boot and every step was agony. I limped forward, trying to stay quiet and keep to the shadows. The temperature had dropped significantly and I was starting to shiver. My shirt was soaked with sweat and the cool night air was cutting through it like a knife. I walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. My sense of time had become as distorted as my sense of direction. I kept expecting to see the highway or hear the sound of traffic, but there was nothing. Just silence and darkness, and the occasional distant rumble of Ephra Holiday's truck. I started to wonder if I'd die out here, if my body would be found weeks or months later, by some rancher or border patrol agent, just another casualty of the desert. That's when I saw it. A faint glow on the horizon. At first, I thought it was the sunrise, but when I checked my phone, I saw it was only a little past midnight. The glow was too localized to be dawn. It had to be artificial light. A town, maybe, or a ranch house, or a gas station. I didn't care what it was. It represented civilization, and civilization meant safety. I adjusted my course and started limping toward the light. As I got closer, I realized the glow was coming from multiple sources. It looked like there were several buildings clustered together, maybe a small settlement or a work camp. I felt a surge of hope. If there were people there, I could get help. I could call the police and tell them about Ephra Holiday and the body in the freezer. I could get medical attention for my ankle and water for my parched throat. I pushed forward, ignoring the pain and exhaustion. But as I got closer, my hope started to fade. The buildings looked abandoned. The lights I'd seen were just bare bulbs hanging from poles swaying in the breeze. There were no vehicles, no signs of life. I approached, cautiously scanning the area for any movement. The settlement consisted of maybe half a dozen structures, all of them in various states of decay. Some had collapsed roofs. Others were missing walls. It looked like a mining camp that had been abandoned decades ago. I walked into the center of the settlement and looked around. There had to be something useful here. A working phone line or a radio or at least some water. I checked the first building I came to. The door was hanging off its hinges and the interior was filled with debris. I moved to the next building and found the same thing. Broken glass, rusted equipment, nothing that could help me. I was starting to panic again. I'd used up what little energy I had left getting here, and now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing to show for it. That's when I heard a voice behind me. It was soft, barely above a whisper. I turned around and saw Marlene Ray Tanner standing in the shadows. She was barefoot and still wearing that oversized dress. Her face was pale and drawn, and she looked terrified. She told me I needed to hide, that her father was coming. I asked her what she was doing here, and she said she'd followed me. She said Ephra Holiday had sent her to track me while he searched in the truck. I didn't know whether to trust her. She was his daughter, after all. But something in her eyes told me she was telling the truth. She was as scared of him as I was, maybe more. I asked her why she was helping me, and she said she wanted to leave. She said she'd been trying to escape for years, but Ephra Holiday always found her. She said if I could get away, maybe I could send help back for her. I told her to come with me, but she shook her head. She said he'd never stop looking for her, that he'd hunt us both down if we ran together. Before I could argue, I heard the sound of the truck approaching. Marlene Ray Tanner grabbed my arm and pulled me toward one of the collapsed buildings. We squeezed through a gap in the wall and crouched down behind a pile of rubble. I could hear the truck getting closer, the engine rumbling and the tires crunching over the rocky ground. The headlights swept across the settlement and I pressed myself flat against the wall. The truck stopped in the center of the settlement and the engine cut off. I heard a door open and footsteps crunching on gravel. Ephra Holiday called out my name. His voice was calm, almost friendly, like he was calling a lost dog. He said he knew I was here, that there was nowhere else I could have gone. He said if I came out now, he'd make it quick. If I made him search, he'd make me suffer. I stayed silent. Marlene Ray Tanner was trembling beside me, her breathing quick and shallow. I put a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her, but she flinched at my touch. I realized she was more afraid of her father than she was of dying out here in the desert. What kind of life had she been living in that house? How long had she been trapped there? I wanted to ask, but this wasn't the time. We needed to stay quiet and hope Ephra Holiday would give up and leave. But he didn't leave. I heard him moving through the settlement, checking each building one by one. His footsteps were slow and deliberate. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew I couldn't have gone far on foot, especially with an injured ankle. He had all the time in the world to find me. I looked around for another way out, but we were trapped. The only exit was the gap we'd come through, and Ephra Holiday was between us and it. His footsteps stopped outside our building. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the wall. Marlene Ray Tanner grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. I held my breath, waiting for him to move on. But he didn't. Instead, he called out to his daughter. He said he knew she was here. He said he was disappointed in her, that she'd betrayed him. He said when he found her, she'd pay for what she'd done. Marlene Ray Tanner let out a small sob and immediately clapped her hand over her mouth. But it was too late. Ephra Holiday had heard her. I heard him moving toward the gap in the wall. I knew we had seconds before he found us. I looked around desperately for something to use as a weapon. My hand closed around a piece of rebar lying in the rubble. It was about 2 feet long and heavy. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Ephra Holiday's silhouette appeared in the gap. He was carrying something in his right hand. In the dim light, I could see it was a hunting knife with a long, curved blade. He stepped into the building and his eyes adjusted to the darkness. When he saw us, he smiled. It was the same cold smile I'd seen back at the house. He told Marlene Ray Tanner to come to him. She shook her head and pressed herself against the wall. He took another step forward and raised the knife. I didn't think. I just acted. I lunged forward, swinging the rebar at his head. He saw me coming and tried to dodge, but he was too slow. The rebar connected with his shoulder with a sickening crack. He grunted in pain and stumbled backward. The knife fell from his hand and clattered on the ground. I swung again, this time aiming for his head. He ducked, and the rebar whistled past his ear and slammed into the wall, sending up a shower of sparks. Ephra Holiday recovered faster than I expected. He charged at me, driving his shoulder into my chest and knocking me backward. I hit the ground hard, and the rebar flew from my hand. He was on top of me in an instant, his hands closing around my throat. His face was inches from mine, and I could see the rage in his eyes. He was going to kill me, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. Then, Marlene Ray Tanner was there. She'd picked up the hunting knife and she drove it into her father's back. He roared in pain and released his grip on my throat. He spun around and backhanded her across the face. She fell to the ground, and the knife stayed in his back. He reached behind him, trying to pull it out, but he couldn't reach it. Blood was spreading across his shirt, and he was breathing hard. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the rebar. Aoife Holiday turned back to me and we locked eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged at me again, and I swung the rebar with everything I had left. It connected with the side of his head, and he dropped like a stone. He hit the ground and didn't move. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with the dust and debris. I stood there gasping for air, trying to process what had just happened. Marlene Ray Tanner got to her feet slowly. Her lip was bleeding, and her cheek was already starting to swell. She looked down at her father's body, and then at me. I asked her if she was okay, and she nodded. I asked her if he was dead, and she bent down to check. She put her fingers to his neck and held them there for a moment. Then she looked up at me and nodded again. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by a wave of nausea. I'd just killed a man. It was self-defense, there was no question about that, but it didn't make it any easier. I dropped the rebar and leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. Marlene Ray Tanner stood up and walked over to me. She said we needed to leave, that we needed to get to the highway and find help. I nodded. She was right. We couldn't stay here. We walked out of the building and over to the pickup truck. The keys were still in the ignition. I climbed into the driver's seat and Marlene Ray Tanner got in on the passenger side. I started the engine and put the truck in gear. I had no idea which direction to go, but I figured if we drove long enough we'd hit a road eventually. I turned the truck around and started driving. We drove in silence for maybe 20 minutes. The desert stretched out in every direction, featureless and endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Aoife Holiday's body sitting up and coming after us. But there was nothing. Just darkness. Marlene Ray Tanner sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. I wanted to say something to comfort her, but I didn't know what. Finally, I saw lights ahead. Real lights, not just bare bulbs swaying in the breeze. As we got closer, I realized it was the highway. I'd never been so happy to see a road in my life. I turned onto the highway and headed north. Within minutes, I saw the lights of a gas station. I pulled in and parked near the entrance. There was an attendant inside, a middle-aged woman reading a magazine behind the counter. I told Marlene Ray Tanner to wait in the truck and I went inside. The attendant looked up when I came in and her eyes widened. I must have looked like hell, covered in dirt and blood with my clothes torn. I told her I needed to use the phone, that it was an emergency. She handed me the phone without asking questions. I dialed 911 and waited for the operator to answer. When she did, I told her everything. I told her about Aoife Holiday and the house and the body in the freezer. I told her about Marlene Ray Tanner and the abandoned settlement. I gave her the best description I could of where we'd been, though I wasn't sure how accurate it was. The operator told me to stay where I was, the police were on their way. She kept me on the line asking questions and making sure I was okay. I answered as best I could, but my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about that freezer and what I'd seen inside. I was thinking about Marlene Ray Tanner and what she'd endured. I was thinking about how close I'd come to ending up dead in the desert. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. There were 3 patrol cars and an ambulance. The officers took statements from both Marlene Ray Tanner and me. They checked my ankle, which was badly swollen, and the paramedics wrapped it and gave me an ice pack. They took Marlene Ray Tanner to the hospital to get checked out. One of the officers told me they were sending units out to find the house and the settlement. He said it might take a while given how remote the area was, but they'd find it. They found it the next day. The house was just as I'd described it, and so was the freezer. There were 3 bodies inside, all of them wrapped in plastic and frozen solid. The police identified them as missing persons from various parts of Texas and New Mexico. People who'd disappeared over the past few years. Drifters mostly. People no one was looking for. Aoife Holiday had been killing for a long time. They also found Aoife Holiday's body at the abandoned settlement just where we'd left it. The coroner determined he'd died from blunt force trauma to the head. The police ruled it self-defense, and I was cleared of any wrongdoing. Marlene Ray Tanner was placed in protective custody while they tried to locate any relatives. She told the police her father had taken her when she was a child, that she didn't remember anything before the house. She'd been his prisoner for over 15 years. I spent 3 days in a hospital in Albuquerque recovering from dehydration and getting my ankle treated. The company I worked for arranged to have my truck towed and repaired. When I was finally released, I went back to work, trying to return to some semblance of normal life. But normal felt like a foreign concept. Every time I drove through the desert, I thought about that night. Every time I passed an isolated house, I wondered what might be happening inside. I never saw Marlene Ray Tanner again after that night at the gas station. I heard through the police that she'd been placed with a foster family in another state. I hoped she was doing okay, that she was finally getting the chance to live a normal life. She'd saved mine, and I'd saved hers. In a way, we were even. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I got lucky. If my truck hadn't broken down in that exact spot, if I'd seen different lights in the distance, if I'd made any number of different choices, I might have ended up in that freezer too. Just another missing person no one was looking for. The first few weeks after I got back on the road were the hardest. I'd taken some time off after leaving the hospital, telling my dispatcher I needed to recover physically and mentally from what had happened. The company was understanding given the circumstances. They even offered to let me switch routes to avoid that stretch of highway between El Paso and Albuquerque. But I refused. I told myself I wasn't going to let what happened change the way I lived my life. I was a trucker, and that route was part of my territory. I wasn't going to avoid it just because of one bad night. Looking back, I realized that was pride talking. Or maybe it was stubbornness. Either way, I should have taken them up on their offer. Because the first time I drove through that area again, everything came flooding back. The darkness, the isolation, the feeling of being hunted. I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. Every shadow looked like Ephra Holiday. Every abandoned structure looked like that house. I made it through the run, but barely. When I got to Albuquerque, I sat in my truck for an hour trying to stop shaking. I thought it would get easier with time. I thought if I just kept driving that route over and over, eventually the memories would fade. But they didn't. If anything, they got worse. I started having nightmares. I'd dream I was back in that house, locked in that bedroom, while Ephra Holiday stalked through the halls looking for me. Or I'd dream I was running through the desert, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The truck would appear behind me, its headlights bearing down, and I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The nightmares started affecting my work. I'd be driving, and suddenly I'd lose focus, my mind drifting back to that night. More than once I caught myself drifting into the other lane and had to jerk the wheel to correct. My dispatcher started getting complaints from clients about late deliveries. I was falling behind schedule, stopping to rest more often than I should have because I was too exhausted to drive safely. I knew I was spiraling, but I didn't know how to stop it. About 2 months after the incident, I was assigned another run through West Texas. It was the same route I'd been on the night my truck broke down. Same time of night, too. I almost called in sick, but I couldn't afford to. I'd already burned through most of my savings during my recovery, and I needed the money. So I loaded up and hit the road, trying to convince myself it would be fine. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun set and darkness fell, and I kept driving. I passed through the same small towns, the same stretches of empty highway. Everything looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. Just empty road. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Ephra Holiday was dead and couldn't hurt me anymore. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things. I was about an hour past El Paso when I saw something that made my heart stop. There was a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder up ahead. Its hazard lights were flashing and the hood was propped open. Someone was standing next to it, waving their arms, trying to flag me down. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep driving, to not stop, to not get involved. But I couldn't do it. What if it was someone who genuinely needed help? What if they were stranded out here just like I'd been? I slowed down and pulled over behind the vehicle. It was an old sedan, maybe from the 90s. The person who'd been waving walked toward my truck and I got a better look at them. It was a woman, probably in her 50s, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She looked relieved when I rolled down my window. She told me her car had overheated and that she'd been stuck here for over an hour. She said her phone had died and she couldn't call for help. She asked if I could give her a ride to the nearest town. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. The location, the time of night, the fact that she was alone. It was too similar to what had happened to me. But I looked at her face, and I saw genuine fear and desperation. She wasn't acting. She was really stranded. I told her to get in, and she thanked me profusely. She climbed into the passenger seat, and I pulled back onto the highway. She introduced herself and told me her name, but I barely heard it. I was too busy scanning the road ahead looking for anything out of the ordinary. She must have noticed my tension because she asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just tired. She said she understood and thanked me again for stopping. She said most people just drove right past her. I said I knew what it was like to be stranded out here. We drove in silence for a while. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to read her body language. She seemed genuine enough. She wasn't fidgeting or looking around nervously. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the windshield. After about 15 minutes, she asked me if I drove this route often. I said yes. She said it must get lonely all that time alone on the road. I agreed. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She asked me if I'd heard about the bodies they'd found out in the desert a couple months back. I felt my throat tighten. I told her I'd heard something about it. She said it was terrible that someone could do that to people. She said the man who did it had been killed himself, that someone had fought back. I nodded, but didn't say anything. She turned to look at me, and I could feel her eyes on me. She asked if I was the one who killed him. I nearly drove off the road. I jerked the wheel and the truck swerved before I got it back under control. I asked her what she was talking about, and she said she'd seen the news reports. She said they'd mentioned a trucker who'd escaped and killed his captor in self-defense. She said my face had been on the news. I told her she was mistaken, that it wasn't me, but she just smiled and said she understood if I didn't want to talk about it. I pulled off at the next exit and stopped at a gas station. I told her this was as far as I could take her, that she could call someone from here. She thanked me and got out of the truck. As she was walking away, she turned back and said something I'll never forget. She said I shouldn't feel guilty about what I did, that Ephra Holiday had deserved what he got. She said she'd known him years ago before he'd moved out to that house. She said he'd always been evil, that it was only a matter of time before someone stopped him. Then she walked into the gas station and disappeared. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. Who was that woman? How did she know Ephra Holiday? And why had she flagged me down specifically? It felt like more than coincidence. It felt planned. But to what end? I thought about going into the gas station to find her to ask her these questions, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just wanted to get away from there as fast as possible. I pulled back onto the highway and continued north. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said about Ephra Holiday being evil, about how someone needed to stop him. Had she known about the bodies? Had she known what he was doing out there in the desert? And if so, why hadn't she gone to the police? When I finally reached Albuquerque, I parked my truck and called the detective who'd handled my case. His name was on the card he'd given me at the hospital. I told him about the woman and what she'd said. He listened quietly and then asked me to describe her. I did the best I could. He was silent for a moment, and then he told me something that sent chills down my spine. He said they'd been looking for a woman matching that description. She was Aoife Holliday's sister. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. His sister. She'd known exactly who I was, and she'd flagged me down anyway. Why? The detective said they'd been trying to locate her for questioning, but she'd disappeared shortly after Aoife Holliday's death. He said she might have information about other victims, about how long the killings had been going on. He asked me if she'd said anything else, anything that might indicate where she was staying or where she was headed. I told him no. After I hung up, I sat in my truck, staring at nothing. Aoife Holliday's sister had sought me out. She'd put herself in my truck alone with me, knowing what I'd done to her brother. That took either incredible courage or incredible stupidity. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe she'd wanted to see me up close to look into the eyes of the man who'd killed her brother. Maybe she'd wanted to decide for herself whether I deserved to live. The thought terrified me. What if she came back? What if she decided she wanted revenge? I started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. Every woman I saw on the street made me wonder if it was her. I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake up at the slightest sound, convinced someone was breaking into my apartment. My dispatcher noticed the change. He asked me if I needed more time off, if I needed to see someone. I told him I was fine, but we both knew I was lying. 3 weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. There was no return address, and the postmark was from somewhere in New Mexico. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. It said, "I know what you did to my brother." It said Aoife Holliday wasn't the monster everyone thought he was. It said he'd been sick, that he'd needed help, but no one would give it to him. It said I'd taken away the only family she had left. It said she'd find me eventually, and when she did, I'd pay for what I'd done. I took the letter to the police. They said they'd look into it, but that without more information, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I vary my routes, change my routine, be more aware of my surroundings. They said if I saw the woman again, I should call them immediately. I nodded and thanked them, but I knew the letter was just the beginning. Aoife Holliday's sister was out there, and she was watching me. I started carrying a gun in my truck. I'd never been much for firearms, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. I got a concealed carry permit and bought a 9mm pistol. I practiced at a shooting range until I felt comfortable with it. I kept it in a holster on my hip whenever I was driving. It made me feel safer, but only marginally. I knew that if she really wanted to get to me, a gun wouldn't be enough. The nightmares got worse. Now, instead of dreaming about Aoife Holliday, I dreamed about his sister. She'd appear in my truck sitting in the passenger seat smiling at me. Or I'd see her standing on the side of the road watching as I drove past. Or I'd come home and find her waiting in my apartment. I'd wake up convinced she was really there, and I'd search every room with my gun drawn. Of course, I never found anything, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I tried to keep working, but it became impossible. I couldn't focus on the road. I was making mistakes, dangerous mistakes. One night I nearly fell asleep at the wheel and drifted into oncoming traffic. I woke up just in time to swerve back into my lane, narrowly avoiding a head-on collision. The other driver laid on their horn, and I watched in my mirror as they gave me the finger. I pulled over and sat there shaking. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. I called my dispatcher the next morning and told him I needed to take an extended leave of absence. He didn't argue. He said he'd been worried about me and that he thought it was the right decision. He said my job would be waiting for me when I was ready to come back. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in my apartment and tried to figure out what to do next. I thought about moving to a different city somewhere far away from Texas and New Mexico. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Ephra Holliday's sister had found me once. She could find me again. Running wouldn't help. I thought about going to the police and asking for protection, but I knew they couldn't spare the resources to guard me indefinitely. I was on my own. I started seeing a therapist. She specialized in trauma and PTSD. I told her everything about Ephra Holliday, about Marlene Ray Tanner, about the bodies in the freezer. I told her about the sister and the letter and the nightmares. She listened without judgment, and then she told me I was experiencing a normal response to an abnormal situation. She said what I'd been through would have traumatized anyone, and that I shouldn't feel ashamed for struggling with it. We worked together over the next few months. She taught me coping techniques, ways to manage the anxiety and the fear. She helped me understand that I'd done what I had to do to survive, that I wasn't a murderer. Slowly, very slowly, I started to feel better. The nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks subsided. I started sleeping through the night again. I even started thinking about going back to work. But I never stopped looking over my shoulder. I never stopped checking my mail for letters with no return address. I never stopped scanning crowds for a familiar face, because I knew that somewhere out there Ephra Holliday's sister was waiting. She'd promised she'd find me, and I believed her. It was just a matter of time. 4 months after I'd taken my leave of absence, I got a call from the detective. He said they'd found Ephra Holliday's sister. She'd been living in a motel in Roswell using a fake name. They'd arrested her after she'd tried to buy a gun from an undercover officer. She'd told them she was planning to kill the man who'd murdered her brother. The detective said I was safe now that she'd be going to prison for a long time. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But I didn't. I just felt empty. The fear I'd been living with for months had become so much a part of me that I didn't know how to exist without it. I thanked the detective and hung up. Then I sat in my apartment and stared at the wall. A week later, I called my dispatcher and told him I was ready to come back. He sounded happy to hear from me. He said they'd missed me and that they had plenty of work if I was ready for it. I said I was. He assigned me a run from Albuquerque to Phoenix. A simple, straightforward route. Nothing that would take me through West Texas. I appreciated that. I loaded up my truck and hit the road. It felt strange to be driving again after so long. The cab felt smaller than I remembered. The road felt narrower. But as the miles passed, I started to relax. I turned on the radio and let the music fill the space. I rolled down the window and felt the wind on my face. For the first time in months, I felt almost normal. But normal is a relative term. I knew I'd never be the same person I was before that night in the desert. That person died when Ephra Holliday locked me in that bedroom. The person I am now is someone different, someone harder, someone more cautious. I don't stop for stranded motorists anymore. I don't take detours through unfamiliar territory. I stick to the main roads and I keep my gun close. Some people might call that paranoia. I call it survival. I still think about Marlene Ray Tanner sometimes. I wonder where she is and if she's okay. I hope she's found some peace, some semblance of a normal life. She deserved that after everything she'd been through. We both did. But I know better than to look for happy endings. Life doesn't work that way, especially not after you've seen what I've seen. The desert at night still makes me uneasy. I can't help but think about all the things that might be hiding out there in the darkness. All the secrets buried in the sand. All the people who disappeared and were never found. Ephra Holliday wasn't the first person to use that desert as a dumping ground, and he won't be the last. There are monsters out there, real ones, and sometimes you don't know they're monsters until it's too late. 6 months passed after Ephra Holliday's sister was arrested, and life started to resemble something close to normal. I was back on the road full-time, taking runs across the Southwest just like I'd done before that night in the desert. My dispatcher was careful about my routes at first, keeping me away from West Texas and the areas where everything had happened. But gradually, as I seemed to be doing better, he started giving me more varied assignments. I appreciated his caution, but part of me felt like I needed to face those roads again. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going to let fear control my life. The nightmares had mostly stopped. I still had them occasionally, but they were less vivid, less frequent. My therapist said that was progress. She said trauma doesn't just disappear overnight, that healing is a long process with setbacks and victories. I was learning to live with what had happened, to accept it as part of my story rather than something that defined me entirely. Some days were harder than others, but I was managing. I'd started dating someone. Her name was irrelevant to this story, but she was kind and patient, and she didn't push me to talk about things I wasn't ready to discuss. She knew I'd been through something traumatic. She'd seen the scars on my hands from that night, and the way I sometimes flinched at unexpected sounds. She never asked for details, and I never offered them. It was an unspoken agreement between us, and it worked. Things were good. Or as good as they could be given everything. I'd even started thinking about the future, about maybe settling down somewhere, buying a house, getting out of the trucking business entirely. My body was starting to feel the years of driving the aches in my back and shoulders that never quite went away. I was only in my mid-30s, but I felt older. The road does that to you. It takes more than it gives. It was a Thursday night in March when everything changed again. I was hauling a load of electronics from Albuquerque to San Antonio. It was a route I'd driven dozens of times before, nothing unusual about it. The weather was clear and the traffic was light. I was making good time and I was in a decent mood. I talked to my girlfriend that morning and she'd mentioned maybe taking a trip together when I got back. Somewhere with a beach, she'd said. Somewhere we could relax. I was about 2 hours outside of Albuquerque when I saw the hitchhiker. She was standing on the shoulder with her thumb out, a small backpack at her feet. She was young, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair. Something about her looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. I drove past her without stopping. I'd learned my lesson about picking up strangers. But as I watched her shrink in my rearview mirror, I felt a pang of guilt. She looked so small and vulnerable out there alone on that empty highway. I drove for another 10 minutes and then I pulled over. I sat there with the engine idling, arguing with myself. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me not to go back, but there was another part, a part that remembered what it was like to be stranded and desperate, that wouldn't let me just leave her there. I turned the truck around and drove back. She was still standing in the same spot when I pulled up. I rolled down my window and asked her where she was headed. She said anywhere east. I told her I could take her as far as San Antonio, and she smiled. It was a warm, genuine smile, and it made me feel better about my decision. She grabbed her backpack and climbed into the cab. She thanked me and settled into the passenger seat. I pulled back onto the highway and we started driving. We made small talk for the first few miles. She told me her name, and I told her mine, though I don't remember what name she gave. She said she was traveling across the country trying to see as much of it as she could before settling down. She asked me about trucking, and I told her about the routes I drove and the places I'd been. She seemed genuinely interested, asking follow-up questions and laughing at my stories. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the conversation. But then she said something that made me tense up. She asked me if I'd ever had anything scary happen on the road. I told her not really, just the usual stuff, bad weather, mechanical problems, nothing too dramatic. She nodded, and then she asked me if I'd heard about the trucker who'd killed that man out in the desert. She said she'd read about it online, that it had been all over the news. I felt my throat tighten. I told her I might have heard something about it, but I didn't remember the details. She turned to look at me, and I could feel her eyes studying my face. She said the trucker's name was Virgil Tanner. She said he'd escaped from a serial killer's house and killed the man in self-defense. She said it was an incredible story of survival. I kept my eyes on the road and didn't respond. She asked me if I knew him, if maybe we'd crossed paths since we both drove the same routes. I told her I didn't know any Virgil Tanner. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that was interesting because she was looking at his driver's license right now. My blood went cold. I looked over and saw she was holding my wallet. She must have taken it from the center console when I wasn't paying attention. She opened it and showed me my license. She said she'd thought she recognized me from the photos she'd seen online. She said she'd been looking for me. I pulled over to the shoulder and stopped the truck. I turned to face her and asked her what she wanted. She smiled again, but this time it wasn't warm. It was cold, calculating. She said she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. She said she'd been thinking about it for a long time, wondering if she had it in her. She said when she'd heard about what I'd done, she'd become fascinated. She wanted to understand what went through my mind in that moment when I'd brought that rebar down on Aoife Holliday's skull. I told her to get out of my truck. She laughed and said no. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a knife. It wasn't a big knife, just a folding blade, maybe 4 inches long, but it was enough. She told me to keep driving. She said if I tried to stop, or if I tried to call for help, she'd use it. I believed her. There was something in her eyes, something unstable that told me she meant every word. I started driving again. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about crashing the truck, deliberately driving into a ditch or a guardrail, but I didn't know if that would stop her or just make things worse. I thought about trying to overpower her, but she had the knife and she was alert, watching my every move. I thought about trying to talk her down, but I didn't know what to say. How do you reason with someone who's clearly unhinged? She started asking me questions about that night in the desert. She wanted to know every detail, what Aoife Holliday had looked like, what the house had been like, what it felt like when I hit him. I answered some of her questions vaguely, hoping to keep her calm. But the more I talked, the more agitated she became. She said I was holding back, that I wasn't giving her the truth. She pressed the knife against my ribs and told me to be honest. So I told her. I told her everything. I told her about the fear and the desperation and the moment when I knew it was either him or me. I told her about the sound the rebar made when it connected with his skull and the way his body had crumpled to the ground. I told her about the blood and the silence that followed. I told her things I'd never told anyone, not even my therapist, and as I talked, I saw her expression change. The excitement in her eyes faded, replaced by something else, disappointment maybe, or disgust. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said it wasn't what she'd expected. She said she'd thought killing someone would be this profound, transformative experience, but hearing me describe it made it sound mundane, almost boring. She said she'd built it up in her head as something more than it was. I told her that was good, that she should be grateful she'd never had to experience it for real. She looked at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. She said she didn't know what was wrong with her, that she shouldn't be thinking these things. I told her she needed help, that whatever she was going through there were people who could support her. I said I'd take her to a hospital or a crisis center somewhere she could talk to professionals. She shook her head and said no one could help her. She said she'd tried therapy and medication and nothing worked. She said the thoughts were always there, lurking in the back of her mind. She said eventually she knew she'd act on them, and that terrified her. We drove in silence for a while. The knife was still pressed against my side, but her grip had loosened. I thought about trying to take it from her, but I didn't want to risk escalating the situation. Instead, I just kept driving and waiting for an opportunity. The highway stretched out ahead of us, empty and dark. There were no other vehicles, no buildings, no signs of life. It was just the two of us alone in the cab of my truck. Then she did something I didn't expect. She started crying. Not quiet tears, but full-body sobs that shook her entire frame. She pulled the knife away from me and held it in her lap. She said she was sorry, that she didn't know why she'd done this. She said she didn't want to hurt me, that she didn't want to hurt anyone. I told her it was okay, that we could figure this out together. I asked her to give me the knife, and she hesitated. For a moment, I thought she was going to hand it over. But then she looked down at the blade, and I saw her expression change again. She said she couldn't live like this anymore. She said the thoughts were too much, that they were consuming her. Before I could react, she turned the knife toward herself and pressed it against her own throat. I slammed on the brakes, and the truck screeched to a halt. The sudden stop threw her forward, and the knife clattered to the floor. I grabbed it before she could, and threw it toward the back of the cab, out of reach. She sat there sobbing with her face in her hands. I didn't know what to do. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I told the operator where we were and what was happening. She said help was on the way and that I should try to keep the girl calm until they arrived. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the dashboard. Then I just sat there with her while she cried. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, along with an ambulance. They took her into custody and transported her to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. One of the officers took my statement and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no, I didn't see the point. She needed help, not punishment. The officer nodded and said he understood. He told me I could go, and I climbed back into my truck. I sat there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Twice now, I'd had encounters that could have ended with me dead. Twice, I'd survived through a combination of luck and circumstance. I didn't know if there would be a third time. I didn't know if my luck would eventually run out. But sitting there in that truck on that empty highway, I made a decision. I was done with long hauls. I was done with overnight drives through isolated areas. I was done putting myself in situations where things could go wrong. I called my dispatcher the next morning and told him I wanted to switch to local routes only. Day trips within 100 miles of Albuquerque, nothing that would take me through remote areas at night. He said he'd see what he could do. A week later, he called me back and said he'd found something. It was less money than I'd been making, but it was steady and safe. I took it without hesitation. That was 8 months ago. I still drive trucks, but now I come home every night. I sleep in my own bed next to my girlfriend. I don't have nightmares anymore, or at least not as often. I put on some weight and my back doesn't hurt as much as it used to. I feel like I'm finally healing, like I'm finally putting that night in the desert behind me. But I still think about it. I think about Ephra Holliday and Marlene Ray Tanner and the bodies in the freezer. I think about his sister and the letter she sent me. I think about the hitchhiker and the knife pressed against my ribs. I think about all the close calls and narrow escapes, and I wonder how many more there might have been if I'd kept driving those routes. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I'll go outside and look up at the stars. I'll think about all those empty highways stretching across the desert and all the people traveling on them. I'll think about the truckers driving through the night trying to make their deliveries on time. I'll think about the stranded motorists and the hitchhikers and the people living in isolated houses miles from anywhere. And I'll wonder what stories they could tell if anyone asked. Because the thing about the road is that everyone has a story. Everyone who drives those highways has seen something or experienced something that changed them. Some stories are worse than others. Some people never make it home to tell their stories at all. I was lucky. I survived. But luck only goes so far. Eventually, it runs out. I got a call last week from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Marlene Ray Tanner. I hadn't heard from her since that night at the gas station, and hearing her voice after all this time was surreal. She said she'd tracked down my number through the police department. She said she wanted to thank me for saving her life. She said she was doing better, that she'd been in therapy and was learning to cope with everything that had happened to her. I told her I was glad to hear it. She asked me how I was doing, and I told her I was okay. We talked for a few minutes, catching up on each other's lives. Then she said something that made my stomach turn. She said she'd been having dreams about her father. She said in the dreams he wasn't dead. She said he'd come back and he was looking for her. She said the dreams felt so real that sometimes she'd wake up and have to check all the locks on her doors and windows just to feel safe. I told her that was normal, that I'd had similar dreams. I told her that Ephra Holiday was dead and that he couldn't hurt her anymore. But even as I said it, I wondered if I believed it myself. Because the truth is, some people don't stay dead. Not really. They live on in your memories, in your nightmares, in the way you look over your shoulder when you're walking alone at night. Ephra Holiday died that night in the abandoned settlement, but in some ways he's still alive. He's still out there in the desert waiting. Marlene Ray Tanner said she had to go. She said she'd call me again sometime. I told her to take care of herself, and she said the same to me. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone. I thought about deleting her number, about cutting that final tie to everything that had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. She was the only other person who truly understood what that night had been like. She was the only one who'd been there, who'd seen what I'd seen. I went inside and found my girlfriend in the kitchen making dinner. She asked me who'd called, and I told her it was an old friend. She didn't press for details. She just smiled and told me dinner would be ready in 10 minutes. I kissed her on the cheek and went to wash up. As I stood at the sink looking at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked older, tired. The desert had taken something from me, something I'd never get back. But I was alive. That counted for something. I'd survived when others hadn't. I'd faced monsters, both human and internal, and I'd come out the other side. Not unscathed, but intact. And maybe that was enough. Maybe survival was its own kind of victory, even if it came with scars. That night, I had the dream again. I was back in Ephra Holiday's house, locked in that bedroom. I could hear him moving through the halls, calling my name. I tried the door, but it was locked. I tried the window, but it was boarded up. There was no way out. The footsteps got closer and closer until they were right outside the door. The handle turned, and the door began to open. I woke up before I could see what was on the other side. My girlfriend was still asleep beside me. I got out of bed carefully, trying not to wake her. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were shaking, and I had to grip the glass tightly to keep from dropping it. I stood there in the darkness, drinking the water and trying to calm my racing heart. Through the window, I could see the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew better than to trust appearances. The desert is full of secrets. Bodies buried in the sand. Houses hidden away from prying eyes. People who disappear without a trace. Ephra Holiday was just one man, but I knew there were others out there. Maybe not as prolific, maybe not as bold, but they existed. The world is full of monsters, and most of them look just like everyone else. You can't tell by looking at them. You can't tell until it's too late. I finished my water and went back to bed. My girlfriend stirred when I got in beside her, but she didn't wake up. I lay there staring at the ceiling and listening to her breathe. I thought about the life we were building together and about the future we were planning. I thought about how fragile it all was, how easily it could be taken away. But I also thought about how lucky I was to have it. How lucky I was to have survived, to have another chance. Some nights I drive past the exit that leads to that stretch of highway where my truck broke down. I never take it. I don't know if I ever will. Part of me wants to face it to prove to myself that I'm not afraid. But another part of me knows there's nothing to be gained from going back. The past is the past, and dwelling on it only gives it power. Better to keep moving forward, to focus on the road ahead. But sometimes late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices that night. What if I'd stayed with my truck instead of walking toward those lights? What if I'd run when Ephra Holiday first locked that door? What if I'd fought back sooner or not at all? Would things have turned out better or worse? Would I even be alive to ask these questions? I'll never know the answers. All I know is that I survived and that survival came at a cost. I'm not the same person I was before that night. I'm harder, more suspicious, more afraid, but I'm also more grateful for the small things. A warm bed, a good meal, someone to come home to. These things matter more now than they used to. They matter because I know how easily they can be taken away. The road is still out there. Those empty highways stretching across the desert. The darkness that swallows everything beyond the reach of your headlights. The isolation that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I don't miss it, but I understand why some people need it, why they can't imagine doing anything else. The road gets into your blood, and it never fully leaves. You can walk away, but you'll always feel its pull. I won't go back, though. Not to those long overnight hauls through remote areas. Not to that life of isolation and uncertainty. I've had my fill of the desert and its secrets. I've seen what hides out there in the darkness, and I don't need to see it again. Some experiences change you in ways you can't undo. Some nights stay with you forever. But I'm still here, still driving, still moving forward. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Keep moving, keep surviving, keep hoping that the monsters will stay in the darkness where they belong. Because if there's one thing I learned from that night in the desert, it's this. The monsters are real, and sometimes they're closer than you think. My name is Harlan Boyett, and I've been running freight along the California-Mexico border for close to 13 years. I've seen just about everything you can see on these roads, from Border Patrol checkpoints that stretch for miles to immigrant groups crossing through the desert at night. I've hauled everything from produce to furniture to electronics, and I've done it all without incident. I keep my head down, do my job, and get paid. That's the way I like it. No drama, no complications, just the road and the cargo and the paycheck at the end. That all changed last November on a stretch of highway about 30 miles north of the border. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was deadheading back to San Diego after dropping a load in Calexico. Deadheading means driving with an empty trailer, which most drivers hate because you're burning fuel without making money. But it's part of the job, and I'd learned to accept it. The weather was clear, and the traffic was light. I had my radio tuned to a talk station, and I was half listening to some political discussion I didn't care about. I was tired, but not dangerously so. I'd gotten a decent night's sleep, and I'd only been on the road for a few hours. I was maybe 20 miles outside of Calexico when I saw it. There was a semi pulled over on the shoulder ahead. At first, I thought maybe the driver was taking a break or checking something on the trailer. But as I got closer, I noticed something off. The truck was sitting at an odd angle, like one of the tires had blown out. The driver's side door was hanging open, and there was no one visible in or around the vehicle. I slowed down as I passed and looked for any sign of the driver, but I didn't see anyone. I should have kept driving. I know that now. But something about the scene bothered me. The truck looked abandoned, but it also looked recent. There was no dust covering it, no signs of weathering. It couldn't have been sitting there for more than a few hours. I thought maybe the driver had gone for help, or maybe they'd gotten a ride from someone. But leaving your rig unattended on the side of the highway is asking for trouble. Cargo gets stolen. Trucks get stripped. It's not something any professional driver would do unless they absolutely had to. I pulled over about 100 yards ahead of the abandoned truck and put on my flashers. I climbed out of my cab and walked back along the shoulder. The sun was hot, even though it was November, and I could feel sweat starting to soak through my shirt. As I got closer to the truck, I could see it was a Freightliner, probably 10 years old. The paint was faded, and there were rust spots around the wheel wells. It looked like it had seen better days, but it was still roadworthy, or at least it should have been. I approached the driver's side and looked into the cab. The keys were still in the ignition, and there was a half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder. A cell phone was sitting on the passenger seat. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but got no response. I walked around to the back of the trailer and checked the doors. They were unlocked. I pulled them open and looked inside. The trailer was mostly empty, except for a few cardboard boxes stacked near the front. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain why the driver had abandoned the truck. I walked back to the cab and climbed up to get a better look. The interior was messy with fast food wrappers and empty soda cans scattered across the floor. There was a jacket draped over the passenger seat and a duffel bag shoved under it. I picked up the cell phone and tried to turn it on, but the battery was dead. I set it back down and looked around for any other clues. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. There were dark stains on the driver's seat. They looked like dried blood. I backed out of the cab quickly and jumped down to the pavement. My heart was pounding and my mind was racing. Blood in the cab meant something bad had happened here. Maybe the driver had been injured. Maybe there'd been an accident or an altercation. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered and I told her where I was and what I'd found. She said she'd dispatch officers to the location and that I should wait there until they arrived. I told her I would. I walked back to my truck and sat in the cab with the engine running and the air conditioning on. I watched the abandoned Freightliner in my mirrors, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The blood could have been from something innocent. Maybe the driver had cut themselves on something or had a nosebleed. But why would they leave their truck? Why would they leave their phone and their keys and all their belongings? It didn't make sense. The police arrived about 30 minutes later. 2 patrol cars pulled up behind the abandoned truck and 4 officers got out. I climbed down from my cab and walked over to meet them. One of the officers asked me what I'd found, and I told him everything. He took notes while I talked and then told me to wait by my truck while they investigated. I did what he said. I watched as the officers searched the Freightliner. They looked in the cab and in the trailer and under the truck. One of them took photos with his phone. Another one made a call on his radio. After about 20 minutes, one of the officers walked over to me. He asked me if I'd touched anything in the truck, and I told him I'd picked up the cell phone, but that was it. He asked me if I'd seen anyone else in the area, and I said no. He thanked me for calling it in and said I was free to go. He gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. I climbed back into my truck and pulled onto the highway. As I drove away, I kept looking in my mirrors at the abandoned Freightliner and the officers swarming around it. I had a bad feeling about the whole thing. Something terrible had happened there and I'd stumbled right into the middle of it. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on the road, but I couldn't. The image of those bloodstains kept flashing through my mind. I made it back to San Diego by early evening. I parked my truck at the company yard and went home to my apartment. I tried to relax, tried to watch TV and forget about what I'd seen, but it was impossible. I kept thinking about that abandoned truck and wondering what had happened to the driver. Around 9 o'clock, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was a detective. He introduced himself as Lowell Creed and said he was investigating the abandoned truck I'd found. He said he wanted to ask me a few more questions and asked if I could come down to the station the next day. I told him I could. He thanked me and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering what kind of questions he could possibly have that the officers on the scene hadn't already asked. The next morning, I drove to the police station. It was a squat concrete building in a part of town I didn't know well. I parked in the visitor lot and went inside. The front desk officer called Detective Lowell Creed, and a few minutes later he came out to meet me. He was a tall man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and a weathered face. He shook my hand and led me back to a small interview room. We sat down across from each other at a metal table. He asked me to go through everything again from the beginning. I told him about seeing the truck on the shoulder and deciding to stop. I told him about the open door and the blood on the seat and the cell phone with the dead battery. He listened without interrupting and took notes on a small pad. When I finished, he asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual about the area around the truck. Any other vehicles or people or signs of a struggle? I told him no. Then he asked me something that caught me off guard. He asked me if I'd looked inside any of the boxes in the trailer. I told him I hadn't, that I'd only glanced inside to see if it was empty. He nodded and wrote something down. He asked me if I knew a man named Raymond Kurtz. I said I didn't. He showed me a photo on his phone. It was a driver's license photo of a heavy-set man in his 40s with a beard. He asked me if I'd ever seen him before, and I said I hadn't. Detective Lowell Creed told me that Raymond Kurtz was the driver of the abandoned Freightliner. He said Kurtz had been reported missing by his employer 2 days earlier when he'd failed to make a scheduled delivery. He said the blood in the cab matched Kurtz's blood type, but that wasn't enough to confirm anything. He said they were treating it as a missing persons case for now, but that it could turn into something more serious depending on what they found. I asked him if there were any leads, and he said not yet. He said they'd checked Kurtz's phone records and his bank accounts but hadn't found anything suspicious. He said Kurtz had no history of violence or drug use. He was just a regular trucker trying to make a living. The detective said sometimes people just disappear, especially in this part of the country. He said the border area was full of dangers, from cartels to human traffickers to simple robberies gone wrong. He asked me if I'd be willing to take a drive with him out to where the truck had been found. He said he wanted to get my perspective on the scene now that it had been processed. I didn't really want to go back there, but I felt like I owed it to Raymond Kurtz, or at least to his family, to do whatever I could to help. I told the detective I'd go with him. We drove out to the location in his unmarked sedan. The abandoned Freightliner was gone now, towed to an impound lot for further investigation. But the spot where it had been was still marked with evidence tape. Detective Lowell Creed parked on the shoulder and we got out. He walked me through what they'd found. Tire tracks in the dirt that suggested another vehicle had been parked nearby. Cigarette butts on the ground that were being tested for DNA. A few drops of blood on the pavement that led away from the truck and then stopped. He asked me to walk him through exactly what I'd done when I'd stopped. I showed him where I'd parked and where I'd walked. I pointed out where I'd climbed into the cab and what I'd seen. He listened carefully and took more notes. Then he asked me something strange. He asked me if I'd noticed any smell coming from the truck. I thought about it and said I didn't remember smelling anything unusual. He nodded and didn't explain why he'd asked. We stood there for a while looking at the empty space where the Freightliner had been. The highway stretched out in both directions, empty and quiet. In the distance, I could see the mountains that marked the border. Detective Lowell Creed said they'd found something else in the trailer. He said it wasn't in any of the boxes I'd seen, but hidden under a false floor panel. He said they'd found personal belongings, wallets, IDs, photographs. He said they belonged to at least 7 different people. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat. I asked him what that meant, and he said they didn't know yet. He said none of the IDs matched any current missing persons reports. He said they were running the names through databases trying to find any connection. He said it was possible Raymond Kurtz was involved in something illegal. Or it was possible he'd stumbled onto something and paid the price for it. Either way, the detective said this case was more complicated than it had first appeared. He drove me back to the station and thanked me for my help. He gave me another card and told me to call if I thought of anything else, no matter how small. I promised I would. I drove back to my apartment and spent the rest of the day trying to process what he'd told me. 7 people, 7 sets of belongings hidden in a truck. What had Raymond Kurtz been mixed up in, and where was he now? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those personal belongings hidden under the floor of the trailer. I thought about the people they'd belonged to and what might have happened to them. I thought about Raymond Kurtz and whether he'd been a victim or a perpetrator. The line between the two seemed blurry. I'd seen enough in my years on the road to know that people aren't always what they seem. Good people do bad things. Bad people sometimes have good reasons. 3 days later, Detective Lowell Creed called me again. He said they'd identified some of the people whose belongings had been found in the truck. He said they were all immigrants who'd crossed the border illegally within the past year. He said none of them had been reported missing because their families assumed they'd made it safely into the country and were just lying low. He said the working theory now was that Raymond Kurtz had been involved in human smuggling and that something had gone wrong during a transport. I asked him if they'd found Kurtz yet, and he said no. He said they'd expanded the search area and brought in search dogs, but there was no trace of him. He said it was like he'd vanished into thin air. He asked me again if I was sure I hadn't seen anything unusual when I'd stopped at the truck. Any other vehicles, any people, anything at all. I told him I was sure, but that wasn't entirely true. As I sat there on the phone with Detective Lowell Creed, I remembered something I'd forgotten to mention. When I'd been standing by the abandoned freightliner waiting for the police to arrive, I'd seen a car pass by slowly. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. It had slowed down as it approached, and the driver had looked at me. I couldn't see their face through the tint, but I could feel them watching me. Then the car had sped up and driven away. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. People slow down to look at accidents and abandoned vehicles all the time. But now, thinking back on it, the way that car had slowed down felt deliberate. Like whoever was inside had been checking to see who I was and what I was doing there. I told Detective Lowell Creed about the car. He asked me if I could remember anything else about it. The make or model or the license plate. I told him I couldn't, that it had all happened too fast. He said that was okay, that it might be important or it might be nothing. He said he'd add it to the case file. We hung up, and I sat there feeling like I'd failed somehow. Like I should have paid more attention, should have noticed more details. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get back to my normal routine. I took loads up and down the coast from San Diego to Los Angeles to San Francisco. I tried not to think about Raymond Kurtz or the abandoned freightliner or the 7 people whose belongings had been found in the trailer. But it was always there in the back of my mind. Every time I passed another semi on the highway, I wondered what they were carrying. Every time I saw someone pulled over on the shoulder, I wondered if they were in trouble. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. Cars that seemed to be following me for too long. Vehicles parked in rest stops with people sitting inside just watching. Faces at truck stops that looked familiar even though I was sure I'd never seen them before. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of what had happened was making me see threats where there were none. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see and that someone knew about it. Then one night, about a month after I'd found the abandoned truck, I got a visitor. I was sitting in my apartment eating a microwaved dinner and watching the news when someone knocked on my door. It was late, maybe 10 o'clock, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw a woman standing in the hallway. She was thin and pale with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and she kept looking over her shoulder like she was afraid someone might be following her. I didn't recognize her, but something about her demeanor made me open the door anyway. She asked me if I was Harlan Boyette, and I said yes. She asked if she could come in and talk to me. I asked her who she was, and she said her name was Inez Marrow. She said she had the information about Raymond Kurtz and the truck I'd found on the highway. That got my attention. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked past me quickly, and I closed the door behind her. She stood in the middle of my living room looking around like she was checking for exits or hidden cameras. I asked her how she'd found me, and she said it hadn't been hard. She said my name had been in the police report and that finding someone's address isn't difficult if you know where to look. I asked her what she wanted, and she said she needed to tell someone what she knew before it was too late. She said she'd tried going to the police, but she was afraid they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they'd put her in danger by investigating. She said I was involved whether I wanted to be or not, and that I deserved to know the truth. I told her to sit down, and she did. She perched on the edge of my couch with her hands clasped in her lap. I sat across from her in my recliner and waited for her to speak. She took a deep breath, and then she told me her story. She said she'd been living in Mexicali for the past 3 years, working odd jobs and trying to save enough money to bring her family north. She said about 6 months ago she'd been approached by a man who offered her a job. He said he needed people to help coordinate transports across the border. He said the pay was good and the work was simple. All she had to do was make phone calls and pass along information. Inez Marrow said she'd known it was illegal, but she'd been desperate. She said she'd taken the job thinking it would only be for a few months until she had enough money saved. But once she was in, she couldn't get out. She said the people running the operation weren't the kind of people you said no to. She said she'd seen what happened to people who tried to leave or who talked to the wrong people. She said they disappeared, and no one asked questions. She said Raymond Kurtz had been part of the operation. He'd been one of the drivers who transported people across the border hidden in his trailer. She said he'd been doing it for years, and that he was good at it. He knew the routes and the checkpoints and how to avoid attention. She said he'd moved hundreds of people, maybe more. But then something had changed. She said about 2 months ago, Kurtz had started asking questions. He'd wanted to know where the people were going after he dropped them off. He'd wanted to know who was in charge and how the money was being split. Inez Marrow said asking questions was dangerous. She said the people running the operation didn't like it when their drivers got curious. She said they'd warned Kurtz to keep his head down and do his job, but he hadn't listened. She said the last time she'd seen him, he'd told her he was getting out. He said he'd found something that proved the operation was more than just smuggling. He said he was going to the police. She'd begged him not to, but he'd insisted. He said he couldn't keep doing this knowing what he knew. I asked her what he'd found, and she said she didn't know exactly. She said Kurtz had been vague, probably trying to protect her. But she said he'd mentioned something about the people who were being transported. He said not all of them were making it to their destinations. She said some of them were disappearing after they were dropped off. She said Kurtz thought someone in the organization was selling people. Not smuggling them, but trafficking them. Taking them to places they'd never agreed to go and selling them to whoever was willing to pay. I felt sick listening to this. I asked her why she was telling me, and she said because I'd found the truck. She said the police were investigating now, and that meant the people running the operation were nervous. She said they were cleaning house, getting rid of anyone who might talk. She said she was afraid she was next. She said she'd gone into hiding, but she couldn't stay hidden forever. She said she needed to tell someone what she knew, so that if something happened to her, there would be a record. She said she'd chosen me because I wasn't a cop and I wasn't part of the operation. She said I was neutral. I told her she needed to go to Detective Lowell Creed and tell him everything. She shook her head and said she couldn't trust the police. She said some of them were on the payroll. She said that's how the operation had survived for so long, because they had protection from the inside. I asked her if she had any proof of that, and she said no, just things she'd overheard. She said Kurtz had believed it too. She said that's why he'd been planning to go to the FBI instead of the local police. I asked her if she knew what had happened to Kurtz, and she said she had a theory. She said the day his truck was found abandoned, she'd gotten a call from one of her contacts in the organization. The contact had told her that Kurtz had been dealt with and that his truck had been left as a message. She said the personal belongings the police had found in the trailer had been planted there to make it look like Kurtz was guilty. She said the real evidence, whatever Kurtz had found, had been taken by the people who killed him. I asked her if she knew where Kurtz's body was, and she said no. She said she assumed it was buried somewhere in the desert where it would never be found. She said that's what they did with people who caused problems. She said the desert was full of unmarked graves. I sat there trying to process everything she was telling me. If what she said was true, then I'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than I'd realized, and the fact that she'd come to me meant I was now on their radar. I asked Inez Marrow what she wanted me to do with this information. She said she wanted me to give it to someone who could do something about it. Someone outside the local police, someone who didn't have ties to the organization. She said she'd written everything down, names, dates, locations, as much as she could remember. She pulled a folded envelope from her jacket and handed it to me. She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to the FBI. She said they were the only ones she trusted to investigate properly. I took the envelope and looked at it. It was sealed, and there was nothing written on the outside. I asked her why she didn't just mail it to the FBI herself, and she said she was afraid it would be intercepted. She said she'd been followed for the past week. She said she'd seen the same cars in different places. She said she'd gotten phone calls from unknown numbers where no one spoke, just breathed into the phone. She said they were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. I asked her where she was staying, and she said she couldn't tell me. She said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. She stood up and headed for the door. I followed her and asked her what she was going to do now. She said she was going to keep running and hope she could stay ahead of them long enough. She said maybe once the FBI had the information they could protect her, but until then she was on her own. She opened the door and looked out into the hallway. She turned back to me and said I should be careful. She said by finding that truck I'd put myself in the middle of something dangerous. She said I should watch my back and trust no one. Then she was gone. I stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the hall and disappear around the corner. I closed the door and locked it. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have for just a few sheets of paper. I thought about opening it, but I decided against it. The less I knew, the better. I put the envelope in a drawer in my kitchen and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Inez Marrow's face, pale and frightened. I saw Raymond Kurtz's abandoned truck with blood on the seat. I saw those personal belongings hidden under the false floor. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, and my phone in my hand ready to call 911 if I heard anything suspicious. But the night passed quietly. When morning came, I was exhausted, but I dragged myself to the shower and got ready for work. I had a load to pick up in Los Angeles, and I couldn't afford to miss it. I thought about calling Detective Lowell Creed and telling him about Inez Marrow's visit, but I remembered what she'd said about not trusting the local police. I decided to wait until I had more information. I drove to Los Angeles and picked up my load. It was a simple run back to San Diego with a delivery scheduled for the next morning. I tried to focus on driving, tried to keep my mind occupied with the road and the traffic, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Inez Marrow had told me. If she was right, then Raymond Kurtz had been murdered for trying to expose a human trafficking ring, and the people who killed him were still out there, still operating, and now they might be after her, and possibly after me. I was about halfway back to San Diego when I noticed a car following me. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. It had been behind me for the past 20 miles, staying a consistent distance back. At first, I thought it was just coincidence, but when I changed lanes, it changed lanes too. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. My heart started racing and I felt sweat break out on my forehead. I thought about the car I'd seen the day I found Raymond Kurtz's truck, the one that had slowed down to look at me. I couldn't be sure it was the same car, but the similarities were too much to ignore. I pulled off at the next exit and drove into a gas station. The sedan followed me off the highway, but it didn't pull into the station. It drove past slowly, and I watched it disappear down the street. I parked at one of the pumps and sat there trying to calm down. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just another driver who happened to be going the same direction. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was keeping tabs on me. I filled up my tank and used the restroom. When I came back out, I looked around for the sedan, but I didn't see it. I climbed back into my truck and pulled back onto the highway. I kept checking my mirrors for the next hour, but the sedan didn't reappear. By the time I reached San Diego, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. I made my delivery the next morning and then headed back to my apartment. I'd decided I needed to give the envelope to Detective Lowell Creed regardless of what Inez Marrow had said about not trusting the police. I couldn't just sit on this information. If people were being trafficked and killed, then someone needed to do something about it. I went to my kitchen and opened the drawer where I'd put the envelope. It was gone. I felt my blood run cold. I pulled the drawer all the way out and dumped its contents on the counter. Pens, receipts, takeout menus, but no envelope. I searched every drawer in the kitchen. I looked in the living room and the bedroom. I tore my apartment apart looking for it, but it was nowhere to be found. Someone had been in my apartment. Someone had taken the envelope. And that meant Inez Marrow had been right. They were watching me. They knew she'd come to see me, and now they had the information she'd risked her life to give me. I called Detective Lowell Creed immediately. I told him everything about Inez Marrow's visit and what she'd told me about Raymond Kurtz and the trafficking operation. I told him about the envelope and how it had been stolen from my apartment. He listened quietly and then asked me a series of questions. Had I seen who took it? Had I noticed any signs of forced entry? Had anyone else known about the envelope? I told him no to all of it. He said he'd send officers to check my apartment for evidence and that I should stay somewhere else for a few nights just to be safe. I asked him if he believed what Inez Marrow had told me, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that some of it aligned with what they'd been finding in their investigation. He said they'd identified 4 of the 7 people whose belongings were found in Kurtz's truck. He said all 4 had been reported missing by family members within the past year. He said they'd been following leads, but they'd hit a lot of dead ends. He said if what Inez Marrow said was true, it would explain a lot. But he said they needed more evidence. They needed witnesses who were willing to testify. They needed to find the people running the operation. I asked him if he'd heard of Inez Marrow before, and he said no. He asked me to describe her, and I did the best I could. He said he'd run her name through their databases and see what came up. He asked me if she'd said where she was staying, and I told him she hadn't. He said that was probably for the best. He said if she was right about there being corrupt cops in the department, then the less information in the system, the better. He said he'd reach out to the FBI and see if they could get involved. He said this was bigger than his department could handle alone. The officers came to my apartment that afternoon. They dusted for prints and checked for signs of forced entry. They didn't find anything. Whoever had broken in had been professional. They'd picked the lock without leaving any marks, and they'd known exactly what they were looking for. One of the officers told me I should consider installing a security system. I told him I would. After they left, I packed a bag and checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. I didn't want to stay in my apartment knowing someone had been inside, knowing they could come back any time they wanted. I spent 3 days in that motel room, barely leaving except to get food. I kept my phone charged and close by waiting for Detective Lowell Creed to call with an update. But the call never came. On the 4th day, I decided I couldn't hide anymore. I needed to get back to work. I needed to keep moving. Sitting in that motel room was driving me crazy. I checked out and drove to the company yard. I was hoping my dispatcher would have a load for me, something that would take me far away from San Diego for a while. He did. It was a run up to Sacramento with a delivery scheduled in 2 days. I loaded up and hit the road. As I drove north, I kept checking my mirrors for any sign of that dark sedan, but I didn't see it. The farther I got from San Diego, the safer I felt. By the time I crossed into Central California, I'd almost convinced myself that the worst was over. That whoever had broken into my apartment had gotten what they wanted and would leave me alone now. I was wrong. I stopped at a truck stop outside of Bakersfield to grab dinner and fuel up. The place was busy with dozens of semis parked in the lot and drivers coming and going. I went inside and ordered a burger and fries. While I was waiting for my food, I saw her, Inez Marrow. She was sitting in a booth in the back corner of the restaurant with her head down and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She was alone. I almost didn't recognize her, but something about the way she sat, hunched over like she was trying to make herself invisible, gave her away. I picked up my food and walked over to her booth. I sat down across from her and she looked up, startled. When she saw it was me, her expression changed from fear to something like relief. She asked me what I was doing here, and I told her I was just passing through. I asked her if she was okay, and she shook her head. She said they'd found her. She said she'd been staying at a friend's place in Los Angeles, but someone had shown up looking for her. She said she'd barely escaped. She said she'd been on the run ever since. I told her about the envelope being stolen from my apartment, and her face went pale. She said that was bad. She said the envelope had contained everything she knew: names, dates, locations. She said without it, there was no evidence. She said she'd been stupid to think she could trust anyone with it. I told her I'd given all the information to a detective and that he was going to contact the FBI. She asked me if I trusted him, and I said I thought so. She said I better hope I was right because if he was dirty, we were both dead. I asked her what she was going to do now, and she said she didn't know. She said she was out of options. She couldn't go to Mexico because they'd find her there. She couldn't stay in California for the same reason. She said she'd been thinking about going east, maybe to Texas or Arizona. Somewhere she could disappear. I asked her if she needed money, and she said she had a little. She said what she really needed was time. Time to figure out her next move. Time to put enough distance between herself and the people looking for her. I made a decision then that I've regretted ever since. I told her I could help her. I told her I was driving up to Sacramento and that I could take her with me. I said from there she could catch a bus east and get as far away as she needed. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she couldn't ask me to do that. I told her she wasn't asking, I was offering. She hesitated, and then she nodded. She said she'd accept my help, but only if I promised to be careful. She said these people were dangerous and they wouldn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. We left the truck stop together. She climbed into my cab and I pulled back onto the highway. For the first hour, neither of us spoke. She sat in the passenger seat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out the window. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that dark sedan appear behind us. But the highway stayed clear. Around midnight, she fell asleep. I kept driving, pushing through my exhaustion and focusing on the road ahead. I wanted to get her to Sacramento as quickly as possible so she could get on that bus and disappear. We were about 50 miles outside of Sacramento when I saw headlights approaching fast in my mirror. It was a car, and it was closing the distance between us quickly. My heart started pounding, and I felt that familiar sense of dread wash over me. I glanced at Inez Marrow, but she was still asleep. The car pulled up alongside me, and I looked over. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. The passenger window rolled down, and I saw a man looking at me. He was wearing a black jacket and sunglasses, even though it was the middle of the night. He made a gesture with his hand, pointing toward the shoulder. He wanted me to pull over. I didn't pull over. I sped up, trying to put distance between us. The sedan matched my speed easily. The man in the passenger seat pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. I saw the flash from the muzzle before I heard the gunshot. My driver's side mirror exploded in a shower of glass and plastic. Inez Marrow woke up screaming. I told her to get down, and she dropped to the floor of the cab. I pushed the truck as fast as it would go, but it was no use. The sedan was faster and more maneuverable. The sedan pulled ahead of me and then cut in front of me, forcing me to brake hard. The trailer jackknifed, and I fought to keep control of the truck. We skidded across both lanes and onto the shoulder. I brought the truck to a stop and sat there with my hand shaking on the wheel. The sedan had stopped about 50 yards ahead. The doors opened, and 2 men got out. They were both wearing dark clothing and both carrying guns. They started walking toward my truck. I looked at Inez Marrow and told her to run. She shook her head and said she couldn't leave me. I told her she had to, that this was her only chance. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she nodded. She opened the passenger door and jumped down. I watched her run into the darkness off the side of the highway. The 2 men saw her, and one of them started to follow, but the other one kept coming toward me. He reached my truck and climbed up onto the running board. He pointed his gun at me through the window and told me to open the door. I did. He grabbed me by the shirt and pulled me out of the cab. I hit the ground hard and felt something in my ribs crack. He stood over me with the gun pointed at my head. He asked me where the woman was going, and I told him I didn't know. He hit me across the face with the gun, and pain exploded through my skull. He asked me again, and I gave him the same answer. He was about to hit me again when we heard sirens in the distance. The man looked up and cursed. He called out to his partner, and they both ran back to the sedan. They climbed in and sped off, leaving me lying on the shoulder. Within minutes, a highway patrol car pulled up with its lights flashing. 2 officers got out and rushed over to me. One of them called for an ambulance while the other asked me what happened. I told them everything, about Inez Marrow and the men with guns and how she'd run into the desert. The officers called for backup, and within an hour there were a dozen patrol cars and a helicopter searching the area. But they never found her. They found tire tracks and shell casings. They found blood on the pavement from where I'd been hit. But Inez Marrow was gone. The officers took me to a hospital where I was treated for a broken rib and a concussion. Detective Lowell Creed showed up a few hours later. He asked me to go through everything again, and I did. He told me the FBI was now involved and that they were taking over the investigation. He said they'd put me in protective custody until they could guarantee my safety. I spent 2 weeks in a safe house on the outskirts of Sacramento. FBI agents came by every day to ask me questions and show me photos trying to identify the men who'd attacked me. I could not identify them. I told them about the dark sedan and the guns and how Inez Marrow had run into the desert. They said they were doing everything they could to find her, but I could tell they didn't think she was alive. I didn't either. If those men had caught her, they would have killed her, and even if she'd escaped them, the desert was unforgiving. Without water or shelter, she wouldn't have lasted more than a day or 2. The FBI eventually cleared me to go home. They said they'd arrested several people connected to the trafficking operation, including 2 police officers who'd been on the payroll. They said they were still looking for the people at the top, but they were confident they'd disrupted the network significantly. They thanked me for my cooperation and told me to contact them if I remembered anything else. I went back to my apartment and tried to resume my normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. I went back to work, but I couldn't focus. Every load I picked up, every highway I drove, I thought about Raymond Kurtz and Inez Marrow. I thought about the people who'd been trafficked and the ones who were still missing. I thought about how easily I could have ended up like them, disappeared without a trace. My dispatcher noticed I wasn't myself. He suggested I take some time off, see a counselor. I told him I was fine, but we both knew I was lying. 3 months after the attack on the highway, I got a letter in the mail. There was no return address and the postmark was from somewhere in Nevada. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. It said, "Thank you for trying to help me." It said she was safe and that she'd started a new life far away from California. It said she thought about me often and hoped I was doing okay. It was signed with just an initial. I stared at that letter for a long time. Inez Marrow was alive. She'd made it out of the desert, and she'd managed to disappear. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, followed immediately by a wave of doubt. Was this letter really from her? Or was it from someone else, someone trying to tie up loose ends? I called Detective Lowell Creed and told him about the letter. He said he'd look into it, but he cautioned me not to get my hopes up. He said people who disappear rarely resurface. He said it was possible the letter was genuine, but it was also possible it was a fake meant to make me stop looking for answers. I asked him if they'd ever found the men who attacked me, and he said no. He said they'd disappeared just like so many others connected to this case. He said the FBI was still investigating, but leads were drying up. He said it was possible we'd never know the full extent of what had happened. I kept that letter in my wallet. I'd take it out sometimes when I was driving and read it. I wanted to believe it was real, that Inez Marrow had survived and built a new life somewhere safe. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a lie, that she was dead and that the letter was just someone's idea of mercy, letting me think she'd made it when really she was buried in the desert alongside Raymond Kurtz and all the others who'd gotten too close to the truth. I still drive trucks. I still run loads up and down the California coast. But I'm different now. I don't stop for abandoned vehicles anymore. I don't pick up hitchhikers. I don't ask questions about the cargo I'm hauling or the people I'm working for. I've learned that some things are better left unknown. That curiosity can get you killed. That the road is full of secrets and most of them should stay buried. Sometimes late at night, when I'm driving through empty stretches of highway, I think about all the trucks I pass and all the drivers behind their wheels. I wonder what they're carrying and what they've seen. I wonder how many of them have stories like mine. How many of them have stumbled onto something they wish they hadn't. How many of them are just trying to survive one more day, one more load, one more mile. The desert is still out there, vast and indifferent. It doesn't care about the people who disappear into it or the secrets they take with them. It just stretches on forever, swallowing everything in silence. I used to find comfort in that emptiness. Now it just makes me uneasy, because I know what's hidden beneath that sand. I know what happens to people who see too much or know too much. I know that the desert keeps its secrets, and it doesn't give them up easily. I never heard from Inez Marrow again after that letter. Detective Lowell Creed retired about a year later. The FBI closed their investigation without ever finding the people at the top of the trafficking ring. Raymond Kurtz's body was never recovered. The 7 people whose belongings were found in his truck were never found either. It was like the whole thing had been erased, swept under the rug, and forgotten. Maybe that's how these things always end, with more questions than answers, with more victims than survivors. I think about quitting sometimes, walking away from trucking and finding something safer, something that doesn't involve long, lonely drives through isolated areas. But I've been doing this for 13 years. It's all I know. And maybe some part of me feels like I owe it to Raymond Kurtz and Inez Marrow and all the others to keep driving. to remember them even if no one else does, to carry their stories with me down these empty highways. Last week, I was driving through that same stretch of road where I found Raymond Kurtz's abandoned truck. I slowed down as I passed the spot where it had been. There was nothing there now, no evidence that anything had ever happened. Just empty shoulder and desert stretching out in every direction. But I could still see it in my mind. The open door, the blood on the seat, the phone with the dead battery. And I wondered how many other spots along this highway held similar stories. How many other trucks had stopped here? How many other people had disappeared? I pulled back onto the highway and kept driving. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning orange and purple. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was a deep sense of unease. Because I know the truth now. I know what happens on these roads when no one's watching. I know about the trucks that carry more than cargo. I know about the people who vanish without a trace. And I know that no matter how far I drive or how fast I go, I'll never be able to outrun what I've seen. The road stretches out ahead of me, endless and dark. Somewhere out there, Inez Marrow might still be alive, living under a different name in a different place. Or she might be dead, buried in the desert with Raymond Kurtz and all the others. I'll probably never know for sure. And maybe that's the worst part of all, not knowing, living with the uncertainty. Wondering if that letter was real, or if it was just one more lie in a story full of them. But I keep driving, because that's what truckers do. We keep moving forward no matter what. We carry our loads, and our secrets, and our ghosts. We travel these highways alone, watching the miles disappear beneath our wheels. And we try not to think too hard about what might be waiting for us around the next curve, or over the next hill. Because once you start thinking about it, once you start asking questions, you realize how thin the line is between the road and the abyss, and how easy it is to cross from one to the other without even realizing it until it's too late. I still have that letter in my wallet. I don't know if I'll ever find out if it was real, but I keep it anyway. Because it's all I have left of Inez Marrow and the brief time she was part of my life. It's proof that she existed, that her story mattered, even if no one else remembers, even if the world has moved on and forgotten. I'll remember, and I'll keep driving these roads carrying her memory with me, until the day I can't drive anymore, until the road finally claims me too.